Yo, let's get it. Seven gang, source gang over everything. You know how we rocking, man. You see the scholars knocking at the door. Let the scholars in. We back again. You know what I'm saying? Another collegiate video for the family. And hey, everybody got smartphones, so if anything you don't catch, pause the video, take your smartphone, and look the information up so we can get you guys on the right path of research. You know what I'm saying? The more of y'all we can encourage more research methodology and get your knowledge and your information and your books up, then I've done my job. So today we're going to finish what we left off yesterday on the genetics of the African population. Yesterday we touched on, the first chapter was touching on the fact that genetics is not cookie cutter. You can be related to someone that looks totally different than you and have different typical traits. Phenotypes can look completely different. You can have someone that looks like a complete European white male and be related to what we call an African. You can have someone that looks like a Japanese, Oriental, or whatever you want to call it, East Asian look, and be related to the Black Andaman Islanders. Same thing with the Austronesian people. They're more closely related to the Philippines, Southwest Asianers, people of that nature, right? But they look completely different. So that's what we covered in the first chapter of the book. In the second chapter is going to dive into some more things. So, hey, it's collegiate. Y'all here. If y'all here, then y'all here to learn. So let's get it. Hey, shalom to Yahukanah. Shalom to Nava. We're going to get it in. Hey, we're going to show y'all degrees of separation between us and them. We actually read material here and we base our arguments off of source material. Shout out to Plumantis, man. That brother been a supporter since day one. Hit that like button. Get the word out. That support. You know what I'm saying? Much love, brother. All right. Before we get into the literature, we are going to show our brother LV Europa some love and let him open up the show with his song. All right, so let's get it.
I got a visa, that's one swipe, the change of demeanor. I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa, that's one swipe, the change of demeanor. I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper. This is a keepsake, hey. You can keep that tucked away. Some gon' come with the lies. Remember them when you pray. Some gon' cry when they die. You don't worry about the decay. Look, I done went through away. My time is short, so I'ma live it today. That shit was real. I had to turn them slaves. But you gotta be brave. It's a land of the free. Gotta move like waves. Hey, put the ring to the pad. I give them path for the rage. Then I put them on the path to take them all up stage. I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up on my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up on my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper. This is a keepsake, hey. You can use this right away. Some gon' come with the truth. Honor them when you pray. Some gon' laugh about their life. They don't worry about delays. Look, I done whip up away that leverage. Remember, you can use it today. Don't worry about how you're gonna get paid. Lord, keep it free, take it away, hey. Don't you wanna be free? Remove that rage. It's a path to the light, hey. Don't misuse those ways. Sweet flow with the truth. Gotta move like waves. I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper. I got a visa. One swipe, they change it to demeanor. I got that almighty baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper.
All right, that's our brother LB Europa. You've been watching us for a while. You know we've been showing love to my brother, holding it down, man, on the musical front. But we're gonna get into it, man, because there's a lot of confusion being spread by the Black pro-conscious community or the conscious community, Sinetta TV. What's some more groups? You got these different fringe groups on the net that teach teach and spread disinformation. You understand? Yeah, hit that like button. Spread disinformation. They say Africans are all the same, all Black people are the same. If you didn't watch the video that we did yesterday, we covered that in great length and great detail. All Black people aren't the same. The Chadic speaking people, for example, are from haplogroup R, which is a European clade, meaning they come from European men. That's what that means in layman's terms. They descend from European men that we would classify European today. Haplogroup R is one of the most predominant Western European DNA markers in Western Europe today. So sometime in times past, there was a migration into Western Africa. And that dispels something else. That dispels that nobody was traveling back and forth from Western Africa. That proves, because you have a foreign haplogroup, a foreign people and their descendants living in the Chadic region of Western Africa. That proves that you had transmigration between the two people and between the two geographical locations. This is the importance of pushing our studies to the next level. You understand? The last video we did was collegiate. This video is going to be collegiate. It's going to be on a college level, what we're talking about, because we're dealing with a PhD here. We're dealing with a doctor. We're dealing with Dr. Ibrahim Muntaser's work. He is a geneticist from Sudan. You understand? So we're taking it to the next level here at the source, and we're going to make an approximation of truth, try to get as close to the truth as possible with our research and validate the things that we're saying. This is why we will tell you we're not afraid of debating anybody on these matters. We'll debate Ankh. We'll debate Ngozi. We'll debate anybody when it comes to DNA, migration, and population genetics. We'll debate an Ashkenazi Jew. If an Ashkenazi Jew has a problem with our stances and what we say, an Israeli has something to say about what we're saying, we will debate it live here on the source. So we're not afraid. We will stand on what we teach here. All right. So when we're dealing with genetics, we're dealing with population genetics, and we're dealing with people, we have to understand this one thing. Genealogy, which is our pedigree, our family tree, right? It cuts across how you look. It cuts across physical traits, hair texture, and that means you could be related to someone that looks totally different than you. And if you didn't watch the first video, that's pretty much what was being discussed in a nutshell. Now we're going to deal with the second chapter of Muntaser's book today, all right? So I want y'all to lock in, and we're going to get through this book. It's just 30 pages. I try not to give y'all the information overload, but this is very pertinent information. My next video I'm going to be covering who are the sons of Ham, and we're going to be dealing with that topic on the level of genetics. We're going to deal with genetics. We're going to deal with genes. We're going to follow the haplogroups and the migration patterns to establish who fits the bill, who is Ham. That's going to be my next presentation on the channel, so that's what you can look forward to. But today we're going to deal with the second chapter in the book by Muntaser. which is titled The Genetics of African Populations. All right. So let's get into it. Let me get my screen set up for you guys. And we're going to actually read here from the source material. It's very rare. If you go to these other channels, these so-called conscious and pro-black channels, very rarely do you see them actually reading from source material. You understand? That should raise some red flags. Should let you know that these people are primarily making this stuff up and not basing it on anything. All right. So we're on chapter 2, History and Genetics in Africa, Multidisciplinary Efforts, right? By Shamarka Omar E. Keita and Muntaser E. Ibrahim. Introduction. It says population studies that integrate genetics and aspects of culture in order to examine historical topics. And that's what we do on this channel. Real quick sidebar. We use population genetics. We interrogate the information to try to examine the historical topics. In our case, we're trying to figure out who the Israelites are. If the Bible's true, then these people must be true. Then they must have genes, because people carry genes and they pass them down to their children. So then we can trace and try to trace and build a clear narrative on who these people are. So that's what we try to do here. The Ashkenazis, the Israelis try to do that as well. They try to say that haplogroup J is the Jewish genetic marker, which makes no sense because the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, have haplogroup J, and according to the biblical narrative and historicity, it shows us that the Greeks come from Javan. So that would mean they come from Japhet. So how can J be the Jewish marker when that's a Japhetic or Japhite marker? They would need a Shemitic marker. And according to our model, we say Shem is from DE. Okay. All right. So let's get back into the reading. It says population studies that integrate genetics and aspects of culture in order to examine historical topics, or that use history or archaeology to help explain geographical patterns of genetic variation, have become more common in the literature. This body of work includes, but is not restricted to, the exploration of the relationship between patterns of genetic and linguistic differentiation. Genetic variation in societies defined as politically simple or complex, even if they fall within the boundaries of states, and the possible association of genetic variation and the spread of cultural innovations, such as the practice of plant and animal domestication. So I'm gonna stop there. We also mentioned that as well. We know people carried or migrated from the Near East into Africa because we can see the Asian crops. We can see the chicken that came from Asia. We can see the humpback cattle that came from Asia. And these are domesticated animals. So in order to domesticate something, you need what? Humans. Humans have to domesticate the animals. This is for livestock. Pastoralists have it. Farmers have it. So if they're carrying these cattle, we can see a movement of people from one area to another. Bananas, coconuts, chickpea seeds, stuff of that nature, yams coming from, Asia into Africa. We see all these things, which were, and any otherwise would be alien or foreign to the African continent. So that lets us know that there was an actual movement of people. And we can also tell because we have people with foreign DNA, like haplogroup T, which is originated in the Near East. These men originated in the Near East, and we see them in South Africa. We see the Limba in South Africa. We see them in Africa, and they carry J, right? We see the Chadic speakers. We see the Fulani. They carry European markers, and they're in Western Africa. That lets you know that what they call endemic migration or diffusion took place, with actual people moved from the Near East, Middle East, Europe, and other localities and actually made their way into Africa. That's what that shows. Because again, every time I bring up a genetic marker, I'm telling you that a man or a group of men at one point of time in times past migrated from one area to another and populated another area. That's all I'm saying in layman's terms. I know some of the terminology might go over the head of some people because they're not familiar with the genetic terms, but that's basically what I'm saying in a nutshell. When I say haplogroup E, I'm talking about male ancestors having children and passing down their DNA, and those children, we find them residing in different areas and localities within the African continent. All right, so let's get back into the reading. So it discussed the practice of plant and animal domestication. And all of these examples, geography and or migration, are major background themes because genes and aspects of culture are evaluated in terms of movement across space and or time. Such work at its best in theory requires the effective use of historical linguistics, archaeology, ethnology, and written and oral historical texts in the context of population genetics, data, and theory. Now, I want to stop there because one of our adversaries to what we believe and what we stand on, Rob Bourne, would say, oh, you can't use oral history. But these population geneticists and these historians and archaeologists are considering oral testimony and oral history. They examined that and they put that into consideration when they built their models. They don't just throw it to the side. They don't toss it to the side. You understand? So again, these people are not really in tune with what's going on in scholarship and academia. Because again, I'm going to read it again. It says, archaeology, ethnology, and written and oral historical texts in the context of population genetics, data, and theory. So they do consider oral historical texts, oral history, when they're making these models and theories and interpretation on what happened in the past. So don't let nobody try to fool you. All right, so let's get into it again. We're right here on this page. It says the term population history is not necessarily used consistently. The subject population may vary in its referent. Genetics and other fields would likely be better understood as having different roles to play in any writing of history from any region in the world. This leads to the question of what kind of data evidence should lead construction of a historical narrative and when. This interesting question may be obvious in some cases, but not so obvious in others. Ideas about identity and whether culture, with or without language, may be more important than ancestry or phenotype in a narrative are points of contestation. In some models of research, genetic profiles could be interpreted in terms of ideas about the geographical origins of genes found in the population, which may give us a quote-unquote history of interaction of gene bearers. But it must be kept in mind that gene history is not the same as population or culture history. The mediators, i.e. gene bearers of particular genes, may not be the population or from the region of the ultimate origin of the genes. And I'm going to stop there. Because you know why that's important? Because we read yesterday that the lion's share of males in Africa, majority of them is haplogroup E. So a lot of people will interpret that as, well, that's where they belong. Well, just because you see the gene bearers there, just as we just read in present time, doesn't mean they were always there or that's their ultimate origin or they derive from Africa. Keep that in mind, all right? So we're going to go back. When I say haplogroup E, again, I'm referring to a group of men that carries these genes, and they pass them down to many of what we call African Americans and many of what we call Western Africans. All right, let's keep reading. It says, time and geography are important. The genetic profile at one time or place for a society does not necessarily tell you about its population, total, cultural, or biological origins. That's exactly what I just said. Haplogroup E dominates Africa today, but that doesn't mean or tell you what it was or where they came from. What was their origin? Where did our ancestors come from? In layman's terms, it doesn't tell you that. And later on, we're going to read prior to haplogroup E dominating these areas, haplogroup A and B was dominating and had predominance of places like Northern Sudan, of places like Northern West Africa. The oldest remains that we find and we were able to get DNA from in Western Africa are from A and B. Those are not our ancestors. We're not related to those people. Those are a different set of males that lived in times past, that lived in the ancient times. We are not related to those individuals. And that's why I'm going to be doing a genetic study on who are the children of Ham and how do we identify them in the field of genetics. You understand? So A and B would be your Khoi people, your San people, these people that used to live in the Sudan, the northern Sudan. You understand? We can see their genes. All right. So you didn't have haplogroup E during that time. You had primarily A and B, which would be these old Khoi people, Bush people, San people. Those type of African tribes were living in those areas and regions during that time. So again, let me read it again. Time and geography are important. The genetic profile at one time or place for a society does not necessarily tell you about its population's total cultural or biological origins, a notion that is not always used consistently or clearly. Different fields may bring different assumptions to the analysis of the data. It also does not tell you about its descendants. Although statistical modeling might be helpful, it is clear that it has real limits. Statistics, Bayesian or otherwise, cannot have predicted the change in population in North and South America or the subsequent history that led to numerous admixed communities. We have to remember that admixture is not a new phenomenon. It is important to say that genetic history is not the same as social or political history. It's to ask how or if genetics would help understand various historical events versus the other data. This chapter will explore some concepts related to these issues. Studies limited solely to linguistics, ethnology, or genetics may successfully restrict explanations to the parameters of their own research traditions and meet the expected canons of those disciplines. However, interdisciplinary studies have to satisfy the canons of multiple disciplines and attend to the issue of tension between the fields, at least in theory. Genes, language, and culture are not intrinsically related or linked, and their association is causal, not causal. At the level of population, they may or may not travel together and may change relationships over time. And that's what we keep telling you. Because a lot of people will say, well, if you guys are Hebrews, you guys are Jews or whatever, why don't you guys speak Hebrew? That's a very silly statement to make. Because genes, language, and culture are not intrinsically related or linked. You can have the genes of an ancient Jew, but you will not have the culture of the language of the ancient Jews. That's not passed down genetically. That's not passed down during sex. When the sperm and the egg meet and performs meiosis, when you get 50% of your dad's genes, 50% of your mom's genes, and they swap with each other and fuse pretty much, right? That does not pass down language and culture. You learn language and culture in society. You learn to speak English because you went to school and learned grammar, learn English grammar or Spanish or whatever language you speak. You learn it while you're living, not during conception. So again, genes, language, and culture are not intrinsically related or linked. So if anybody asks you that silly question, that's just coming from a place of ignorance. That's not how genes work. And culture, we're like, why all your people don't practice the culture? Culture is not passed down during sex either. That's learned in society or the group that you grew up in. Like many blacks from the South, Southern Baptists, where did you learn that from? The society that you were in. You learn that while you're living, not through conception. That's not passed down as genes. All right. So just wanted to clear that up because I know a lot of these erroneous arguments that are made by the opposition. All right, so it says together, they may or may not travel together and may change relationship over time, and that's what I just explained to you. They pertain to different levels of order in complex systems, with the information content of biological systems in some sense being more reducible for the purposes of historical inquiry. interrogating disparate layers of uncertainty and predictability between information from biological and social systems awaits the establishment of appropriate and perhaps often novel tools. So basically what he's saying is the technology hasn't got to the point where they can actually determine these things with 100% exactness. Okay. It says, although language and culture ought to be analytically separated depending on the definition of culture, we acknowledge that sometimes they get treated together and that this may be appropriate in some situations. However, the reduction of genes to language, families, and cultures with the implication of causality or unnecessary linkage is to be avoided, as it can lead to assumptions about the ability of genetics to, for example, determine whether a given language or languages families belong in a particular phylum. Again, that's what I was telling you. Phylum, meaning a family or family group, right? So if anybody tells you, well, all black people should be speaking Hebrew if they're Jews, that is nonsense. That is nonsensical. That doesn't make any sense at all. Because genes don't work like that. Genes don't pass down languages. You as a grown man now could go learn Chinese. You can go learn Japanese. You can pick up and learn languages. Has nothing to do with genes at all. Okay, many of us speak English because we're in a country that the predominant language here is English. Has nothing to do with our genes. If you were born in another foreign country, let's say Russia, you would learn Russian. We have a lot of idiotic notions going on in the black community, especially the so-called woke or conscious community. But that's fine. That's why I'm here for. I'm here to erode these things. Okay, let's keep reading. Linguistic evidence is used to make linguistic classifications. Biological evidence is used to make biological classifications. Archaeological classifications are based on archaeological data. Music is correctly classified based on musical elements, not the social identity of those playing the music, even if there is a discord around who should be playing what kind of music. The association between genetic patterns and linguistic assignments to families is not a directly causal one, rather than an outcome of isolation mechanisms that operates in creation of reproductive isolation. Theoretically, people with similar languages and cultures are more prone and likely to exchange mates with each other, which does not mean that observed association between genes and language culture are causal. For example, one cannot construct a taxonomy of languages based on craniofacial traits. All of this raises another point. The majority of people now speaking a given language or practicing a particular religion, in some sense a cultural phenomenon, or who are making particular artifacts may not be genetically or genealogically the closest to or the same as the founding population or the one initially associated with a particular phenomenon. And this is what we've been telling you. Just because people today claim or practice or speak a language does not mean they connect to those that are from the ancient days that originated or were the first people speaking that language. You understand? Because again, these things are picked up in the society that you live in. It's not passed down genetically. All right? I'm just gonna have to beat that in you guys' head, because that's what's going on, and that's what's the disinformation that's being spread by this so-called conscious community. Any population may have multiple ancestries. How it is identified is based on other rules. An example is people in the United States and Latin America who may have ancestries from various continents. A person may be of Irish descent, but not Irish identified due to social practices. This example describes many legacies Afro-North Americans of a Middle Passage descent with legacies denoting African ancestors who were enslaved or indentured persons on U.S. ground. But the term could be extended to those in Latin America and other places. In Latin America, there are many people with some African ancestry via the Middle Passage, but who are not identified as Afro-Latinos, a term that seems to be usually reserved for those with obvious, quote-unquote, tropical African ancestry living in certain communities that may be culturally somewhat distinct with others like them, along with those in this era who chose to self-identify in this way as individuals. It can be hypothesized that most of the African ancestry in Latin America is dispersed in the general populations and not located in the Afro-identified enclaves. There are many people of Middle Passage descent in various regions if the phrase is treated as a denotation of some African ancestry. Studies that use multiple sources to look at populations engender numerous difficulties and themselves due to the absence of good or perhaps good enough data quality from multiple disciplines. However, they are made even more complicated because of the difficulty of keeping abreast of the developments in many disciplines, not only points of contention and various views of a topic, but major reinterpretations of evidence and the nuanced opinions found within specialized fields. Let me stop right there and make some commentary on that. Here's another thing. Ankh was talking about science don't deal with belief. They deal with belief. They deal with interpretation. That's going with your belief. How you interpret the data. When they say putative is what they believe happened. When they say law of parsimony or parsimony's explanation, it's the best explanation they could come up with is what they believe took place to explain a phenomenon. They deal with belief. And we just read it. We're talking about multiple disciplinary fields. We're talking about archaeologists. We're talking about geneticists, population geneticists. This is how they interpret. They try to interpret evidence, and they have nuanced opinions. They have opinions about the evidence. All right? So don't let anybody fool you that these scientists or these professionals, if you will, are like all-knowing and omniscient, like they're gods or something. No, they are taking information and interpreting the data the best they can with the information and the tools that are available to them. All right, and I also want to touch on about being identified due to social practices. Like majority of our people, the African Americans, you are identified by your skin color. We have a binary oppositional model here in America. Black can't be white, white can't be black. That's basically what that means. And we pretty much had this racist model since the 17th century, 18th century era, identifying us based on our skin color. You understand? You're black, he's white, you're black. And that's what they'll tell you. How are you a Jew? You're not white. They have something else called hyphenated whiteness, where you have to have, if you're Jew, you have to have the white skin. You have to have a hyphen white to be authenticated. That's based off social practices. That has nothing to do with genealogy. That has nothing to do with genetics. That has nothing to do if your ancestors are really Israelites or not. That has everything to do with the social climate that we live in here in America. That's what that has something to do with. All right. So let's keep reading. All right, so we left off at specialized fields. It says this problem is shared by researchers and readers alike, and it could be argued that all such published works should give some review of previous ideas and research in the associated sociology of knowledge when appropriate. So what is the problem he's talking about? He's talking about how we reinterpret or interpret evidence and the nuanced opinions that come with evidence, because we're all human. We all can be fallible, right? So we have to do the best we can. We don't have time machines, so we have to just examine the evidence, interpret the best way we can with what we have, and try to approximate the truth, meaning we come close to the truth as we can, right? A fair and a balanced system. Let's keep going. Common agreed upon criteria to evaluate multidisciplinary studies still await development. Until that time, assessments must use the canons of the involved disciplines. Using standard philosophical perspectives will also help. Broadly speaking, explanation in science is based on natural laws or principles, but in history on the role of contingent unique events not amenable to natural laws in the conventional sense. The terms nomothetic and ideographic, respectively, are often used to describe the former and latter modes of explanation. Population histories have a double standard to meet, namely adequacy in terms of biological theory and the credibility and fairness required by historians in order to acknowledge and avoid bias in descriptions, interpretations, and explanations, or admit their existence in fair balance and not misleading. Apparently, most historians do care and argue about these issues, although in the context of postmodernist thought and practice, the idea has arisen that some general interpretation are often idiosyncratic. Most certainly, no scientist would espouse such a perspective in doing what might be called the work of classic science. However, when such work, specifically genetics, is used as a part of historical inquiry, a new element enters into an enterprise that has now become synthetic The credibility of a causal explanation should be supported by objective evidence that supports one narrative more than another. In some cases, this may not be possible, and this should be admitted as well. Again, what we was talking about earlier, we're doing the best we can with the information and data that we have. That's why I said in some cases this may not be possible, but we try to give you the causal explanation to the best of our ability with the objective evidence that we have, right? In the most general terms, reading on, it says, in the most general terms, historical works can be evaluated by examining how well they explicitly present and discuss alternative explanations, avoid generalizing from incomplete information, and show proper consideration for all available information or differing views of the same evidence. Broadly speaking, historical writing, according to McCullough, can be biased in four ways: the misinterpretation of evidence, which could include an incomplete review or misreading of data. Let me stop there. A lot of people from the conscious community, a lot of you brothers and sisters from the conscious community, you do this all the time. You have done it on the channel. We have reviewed it on the channel, what you have done. You'll say, well, this brother said this, book said this, he was wrong. Then I'll go back and actually pull up the page and say what it says verbatim. And I was like, this is what the book says. You didn't take out the time to read it, or you misread it. So that's something you have to be careful of when we're dealing with scholarship and academia. Make sure that you have a full review and you're not misreading the data. It says the presentation of unfair and unbalanced accounts, which may be true at some level, but otherwise omit significant information. A general description of the past that implies facts that are known to be false, and a selectively in the presentation of causal explanations where not all of the important causes are given to the reader, hence leaving a false impression. These shortcomings can be made by mistake, in which case they are simply unjustifiable or wrong. For McCullough, they become biased when they occur because the scholar wants the particular outcome produced by these failures. To this can be added outcomes that are expected or subconsciously produced due to embedded cultural beliefs. These may not always be recognizable. It is possible, however, to produce credible accounts that are not comprehensive as long as this is explained, thus allowing a critical evaluation. Interdisciplinary work may be more prone to these kinds of errors. And this is why also I challenge the other side of opposition and try to say and lock Africans and make them a static ethnicity, where they say West Africans were stuck in West Africa for thousands and thousands of years, and they didn't do any migration, didn't do any trade, wasn't involved in maritime, wasn't involved with any advancement in technology. They were stuck in West Africa for thousands of years. They have to demonstrate that. It has to be demonstrable. They have to show a model. They have to show these things. We should see the genes. We should see the culture. We should see everything stuck in Africa and not having any endemic or cultural diffusion at all. They don't show that. But what we do see in the archaeological record, what we do see is a movement of people from the East into Africa. We do actually see that. And that's why many geneticists like Vincent Cabrera is arguing for origin of haplogroup E in the Near East. Right? Let me keep reading. It said it is possible, however, to produce credible accounts that are not comprehensive as long as this is explained, thus allowing a critical evaluation. Interdisciplinary work may be more prone to these kinds of errors. Geneticists doing work on recent populations that is conceptualized and presented as historical work have some burden due to all the issues mentioned above. The pattern of genes across geographical and or ethnocultural spaces cannot be used as the sole evidence for constructing the narrative of population history or genetic history. Although they identify ancestral components on one level based on the names of their databases. One theoretical issue not often confronted is the ranking of data in terms of what primarily determines the framework of a narrative. Should genetic data ever be used to construct a narrative, i.e. construct its framework, with other data being fit into patterns of genetic findings? Or should the genetic data be subsumed to historical frameworks determined by text, archaeology, linguistics, etc.? Is reciprocal illumination possible without falling into circular reasoning? And what are the criteria of its limits? When do genetic data become primary? It is clear that some concepts, facts, or factoids could lead to erroneous narratives, and some of these are rooted in bad concepts or conceptual schema. Let me bring up again something else that's rooted in bad concepts is that the fact that we're quote unquote black or we have melanin in our skin, that we couldn't be related to anyone from certain parts of the world, i.e. the Near East. You understand? That's a bad concept because our skin color and our physical traits have nothing to do with that. Whether our ancestors were able to migrate, to trade, you understand, and to travel, that has nothing to do with that. All right, let's keep reading. Historical explanation and general interpretation of the past are expected to be fair and not misleading, even if there is no claim that they are comprehensive. Here we suggest that better narratives are likely to result when teams work in what might be called historical genetics. Multiple disciplines are more likely to produce reports that are conscious of bias in concepts and interpretations. Studies of African-based or related topics provide interesting cases with which to explore the utility of good collaboration in multidisciplinary work. One anecdote serves to illustrate this. Gould reported that Petrus Camper, the famous 18th century Dutch anatomist and inventor of the facial angle, criticized contemporary artists for their renditions of the African mongoose in the nativity paintings. Camper noted that the depictions were simply Europeans painted black, Europeans painted black or dark brown, and that their faces were morphologically incorrect in terms of the underlying bone structure. He observed that the physiognomy in terms of nose shape and facial profile were incorrect. Gould seems to agree with this assessment. However, Camper overstated his cause. He apparently based his criticism on his knowledge at this time of only the physiognomy of a subset of certain enslaved Africans from the forest belt of West Africa, who primarily possessed the so-called Negro anatomical conformations, which was abstracted into a type resulting sometime into error called misplaced concreteness in discussion about authentic Africans. Even in Camper's time, it was known by some Europeans that there were also a variation in bony anatomical complex associated with dark skin and frizzy hair. There are dark-skinned Africans with physiognomies that are similar to those of Europeans and having narrow noses, or orthodonticism, etc. But the trait complexes in question should best be described with anatomical terms and not in group terms from a racial typological paradigm that implies that individuals with given morphological complex all necessarily have a common origin. We talked about this last time. Just because people have similar physical traits does not mean they have a common origin, does not mean they share ancestors. And that's the problem with this African theory, that all Africans are the same. And that's why I said I would debate anybody on that. If all black people, all Africans, or what we consider Africans are the same, all African Americans are not the same. And that's a fact. We can go to Family Tree DNA right now and pull up the Y chromosome charts on certain areas with African Americans, and you're going to see that African Americans have European haplogroups, meaning they descend from white males, European white males. That's what that means. So no, we're not all the same. Some of them are R, some of them are J. Even though they have the same physical, we share the same physical traits, we may look similar on the outside, but the genes on the inside are different. And that's why it's important to analyze DNA. In the idea of the anti-evolutionary at its core, had Camper known at the time of that writing about the range of variation, even in West Africa, he perhaps would have made other criticisms, since there are other aspects of bony facial variations that will differentiate populations who broadly share these traits. Camper apparently learned about the variation in tropical Africa later. This anatomical complex, composed of a narrow nose or orthodonticism and a narrow face, no matter where found, was once interpreted as being necessarily Caucasian or Caucasoid, or Caucasoid origin via migration or gene flow in a model of racial origins. This assumes a necessary group of geographical origin for these traits versus there being products of adaptive microevolution or drift. In the tropical African context, Hernu suggested the term elongated African for this physiognomy and variance, a phrase that emphasizes a relatively narrower nose and face that evolved in a hot, dry climate, but has some variation. The authors would prefer that the phrase elongated African trend be used. Its counterpart would be the broad African trend. And it is admitted that this is a phenotypically and incomplete suggestion. The use of the word trend conveys the existence of a continuum which should not be broken into discrete types, but can be mathematically described with descriptive multivariate approaches. This is also omitted to only to refer descriptively to craniofacial shape in some sense consistent with morphometric findings. It says nothing about other traits. Some migration and admixture are not denied as a part of African biohistory. But if most of the gene flow has been so long ago as to have been reworked by African selection pressures and social circumstances, then it constitutes a part of a genuine African biogeographical and biocultural history. Overlapping a range of biological traits between biogeographical Africans and non-Africans should be expected based on evolutionary theory and the concept of serial founder effect, as well as recurrent gene flow in multiple directions. So basically what he just said in a nutshell is just because they have a smaller nose or a wide nose doesn't mean that they are the same, and it doesn't mean that they're different. We have to look at the gene flow and where these people come from, right? And he also throws in there it could be from environmental selection pressures or social circumstances, right, that cause these different phenotypes, different nose shapes or whatnot. All right, so let's keep reading. It says the primary purpose here is not criticism, but an exploration of cases because in general, multidisciplinary cooperation has not been maximized and African participation has been minimal. While older literature is featured, for example, this is not a review, older ways of thinking have a way of reemerging and persisting in our knowledge templates and cognitive maps. And that's huge because that's true. That's true. Older ways of thinking does have a way of reemerging, persisting in our knowledge templates, because many of the people maybe watching today, or many of the people that will watch this video, you're stuck on what they call the binary oppositional model, where you think, well, if a person's black, he can't be white, and if a person's white, he can't be black. Well, genetics cuts across black, white, whatever you are, whatever you look like. You can still be related to someone no matter what hair texture they have, no matter what skin color they have. That's a very old, antiquated way of thinking. It's outdated. And a lot of these people that are in the conscious community, a lot of these internet Israelites, a lot of them are carrying that same mode of thinking into 2021, into their arguments, into their debates, into their teachings, the way they think. And it's time to get rid of that, man. You're carrying scientific racism from the 18th century Germans. They came with this modern racial theory, 5 race theory, Africa equal black, Native Indian equal red, Asian is yellow. I think the Philippines areas is brown, and then Europe is white. They came up with that, which makes no sense because Cheddar Man, he's from Western Europe. He was black. He was a black man. He had dark skin. And they even published that all of Ireland, all of Western Europe was black during that time, during the Mesolithic Middle Stone period in Europe. So that doesn't even make any sense. So we got better evidence, better data. It's time to move on and leave the past in the past. We don't need those old modes of thinking. A lot of you Israelites use that. Y'all use this black and white dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. All right. And that's why I'm doing these videos, to educate you and uplift the community to get past this. Because we're using a lot of redneck arguments, a lot of old, antiquated German arguments to build a lot of our stances, man. And it's time to let that stuff go. So again, older ways of thinking have a way of reemerging and persisting in our knowledge templates and cognitive maps. While some critique is implicit in this discussion, it is only in the context of an examination of data or ideas in order to increase awareness of the problems of such work, hypothesis generation, and not for the criticism's own sake. Topical cases are presented in an effort to illustrate the value of having multidisciplinary teams. The analyses are intended to illustrate the range of possible explanation by interrogating various lines of evidence. It is important to be vigilant against simplistically answering one discipline question when another's data. All right, so the next portion is genetics and the Bantu speakers. All right, it says Bantu language is collectively a group within the Niger Kordofani, Fanian, or Niger Congo family, are spoken west to east from the Cameroons to Kenya, and then south to the Cape of Good Hope. Bantu is a linguistic term. Its speakers are not a single people, although one sees the word listed as though it were describing a specific ethnic group, breeding population, or even racial group. Sometimes it seems to be used as a euphemism for Negro or Negroid, which is unacceptable. The term Bantu expansion refers to the spread of the linguistic grouping. The direction of movement is generally accepted as having been from east of Nigeria in the southern and eastern direction to the sub-equatorial regions. But how much was due to the mass movement of people versus language diffusion from community to community is a point of discussion. The PN2 V38M2 biallelic lineage in part maps to the distribution of the family, as does haplotype 4 of the table 49A system, which in African and adjacent regions apparently marks the same clade. The spread of this family is frequently identified with the distribution of these variants in nearly causal fashion. In other words, the biallelic allele V38M2 is said to be a marker of the Bantu expansion, and that's important because many African Americans are M2. We are of the EM2 clade, E1B1A, right? It says, with some earlier writers who mistakenly called languages in this region Bantu, even thought had gone into West Africa. However, RFLP haplotype 4 V38M2 is found in very high frequencies in Africa, west of the Cameroons, from Nigeria to the Atlantic, reaching a frequency of 80% in samples from Senegal. Just as interesting, it is reported frequency in one study of Egypt, 27%, and Nubia, 39%. There are currently no Bantu speakers in these regions and no evidence that they expanded into the region as settlers, although some ancestral Egyptians and inhabitants of the Sahara may have had contact with early Niger, Congo, and Nilo-Saharan speakers based on likely loan words. Hence, the Bantu expansion, a problematic concept, especially as often conceived in any case, cannot be used to explain M2 presence found in some studies of Nile Valley populations. And there is no need to invoke the overworn trope of the slave trade, which cannot explain everything. And that's another thing. So wherever they find our descendants, our ancestors, wherever they find our genes, they try to invoke or bring up the slave trade. Oh, well, the reason why you find E1B1A in Egypt is because of the slave trade. No, it was there prior to the slave trade. You know how we know that? Because Ramesses III has E1B1A. He's EV38. That's E1B1A. He's related to us. He was in Egypt. Okay? You talking about what? 13th century BCE? That's way before the modern slave trade. So can we stop invoking and bringing up the slave trade to try to explain our people wherever they are? If they're in Russia, don't automatically assume it's a result of the damn slave trade, man. That's lazy and it's idiotic and it's racist. It's like, oh, well, if a black person's outside of Africa or anywhere outside of Western Africa, then it must be due to slave trade because they didn't have any other mode of transportation or trade or anything else to make them move outside of Africa. That's how we think. We got to stop that, man. You got to understand that our people expanded, moved outside of Africa, within Africa for eons. The proof of that is they found E1B1A outside of Italy 7,000 years ago. All right? So come on, man. Y'all have these old antiquated arguments. We're trying to get rid of them. All right, so just like the brother put in his book, slave trade don't answer everything. We got to stop invoking that. Stop bringing it up. It says the Bantu expansion should not be conceived as having been a mass movement of a single people analogous to the Mefficane or migration of the Banu Hilal. Archaeology and historical linguistics may possibly help explore credible explanations, but only at the time depths where migrations of early speakers might have been real historical phenomenon. The V38M2 haplotype 4 marker is found at great frequencies in the Niger-Congo speakers in general. It is possible that V38M2 existed in the speakers of the early ancestral family Proto-Niger-Congo and got distributed into speakers of all of its branches as the population biolinguistically differentiated through space and time. This explanation does not work for Egypt and Nubia at a macro level, since languages spoken there belong to other families. And if close correlation between languages and populations is assumed, which can be problematic, the caveat is that there is evidence for Nilo-Saharan and Niger-Congo loanwords in ancient Egyptian. However, archaeological data indicate a late Pleistocene recolonization of Eastern Sahara after a probable population hiatus between 50 to 15,000 years ago. The peoples involved can be expected to have been highly biologically and culturally diverse. The early Holocene wet, sometimes called Green Sahara, with its inhabitable places, can be envisioned as at various times as have been the site of a meta-population, with there having been contacts between various groups. This marker may have entered the Nile Valley with mid-Holocene population Saharan migrations into the Nile Valley, which contributed to the peopling of the valley. The primary pastoral community, as defined by Winogrove, had extensive north-south Sahara Nile Valley geographical roots and distribution, and was apparently a transcommunal entity whose common cultural base would have likely facilitated gene flow between populations. In other words, if it's I'm trying to use the words he used, a transcommunal entity, and they're ensuring gene flow between population, that means there has to have been travel between this part of Africa, the Nile, and the Sahara, and what we call the Niger-Congo. It says another possibility is that the Nilo-Saharan, to which Nubians belong, and Niger-Congo from a larger language phylum called Congo-Saharan or Niger-Saharan, whose earliest speakers shared a biohistorical heritage that included the V38M2 4 marker. This could also explain the notable frequencies in the Egyptian Nubians and NC speakers as a whole, and not just Bantu speakers. However, there's a caveat. From a strictly biological point of view, it is important to note that M2 likely arose before any of the language families emerged. Based on the standard estimates of the ages for language families and most certainly their branches, it is wrong to treat them in fact as having a basal or causal relationship. This would also be true for the Afroasiatic. It is worthwhile making the observation that the P2 marker or clade, sometimes called E1B1, which is ancestral to both M2, 215, M35, is father to the male clades whose bearers are speakers of 3 different language macro families in Africa, which one of them being Afroasiatic. That's huge. I bet you the conscious community don't tell you that. The E1B1 clade is responsible for bringing in those that speak the Afroasiatic languages, also called Afrasian or Afrasan. This is intriguing because the ancestral language of P2 father at the population level is not known. What was it, a language that went extinct with a subsequent sorting of languages into different families? Where there's some sort of ancestral aerial linguistic entity that does not fit current normative constructs? Was there an early Proto-African language family that led to the current language families? Most Western linguists would say no to this last question at the time of this writing, at least to the simple notion of a Pan-African ancestor, although this is worth exploring. However, for those historical linguists who believe that larger groupings of ancestral language families can be reconstructed, a parsimonious answer would be that the P2 population spoke some fragment of proto-world that remained in Africa after modern humans left. This is hypothetical proto-world fragment. This hypothetical proto-world fragment may have had some substructuring that explains some of the recovered similarities between different African families and those outside of Africa. It is generally hypothesized that all language phyla, like all human populations, are related, just to different degrees. Spaces do not permit a full discussion of this matter. The simplistic racialized gene language maps or denograms that were once drawn as validation of a schema of disconnected race populations fall apart when the Y chromosome lineages are examined against the geography of language families and their origins. So, bringing up that hypothesis that all language groups derive from one language group, the Bible actually says that if you know about the Tower of Babel, it explains that through the Tower of Babel. You can say it's mythos, but hey, the linguists are pretty much agreeing with the same sentiments that we find in the story of the Tower of Babel, that all languages split and people went their way. Maybe it didn't happen like that, but maybe all languages did derive from one ancient or archaic language. Just keep going. It says a multidisciplinary approach clearly can help to avoid overgeneralization with regard to Bantu speakers. Misinterpretations can skew interpretations. This in turn could lead to poor study designs and future work. Another issue is the use of Bantu as a euphemism for Negro from the old unscientific racial schema, which seems to be how some geneticists and morphologists are using the term. While this issue is beyond the scope of this chapter, it deserves mentioning given the emphasis placed on the sequencing of a Bantu genome, which strictly speaking would have to mean looking at genes that were thought to have arisen at the time the Bantu linguistic branch emerged, and those speakers and not those now found in the bodies of the current Bantu speakers, which may not be the same as original speakers or their ancestors. Before Bantu even arose as a language unit, the descendants could be different due to language shift and or substantial microevolution, which includes gene flow. All right, so now we're going to deal with genes, food production, and aphrasion. The spread of animal and plant domestication is now frequently argued to be associated with dispersal of language families via demic diffusion, the actual migration of expanding population over space. Instead of cultural diffusion, such movement would have implication for spatial patterns of genetic variation. This claims for coterminous spread of genes, languages, and or food production is most successfully made by reconciling data and interpretations from genetics, historical linguistics, and archaeology. When sufficient evidence is available, a multidisciplinary approach requires testing all models. In terms of Africa, one interesting case regards the Afrasian Afro-Asiatic language phylum or family, the spread of domesticated wheat, barley, goats, and sheep into northern Africa from Southwest Asia, the Near East. Now, before I continue to read, a lot of us, we use the word culture diffusion when we're bringing up our arguments about Israelites coming into Egypt or coming into Africa. Really, you need to be using the term demic diffusion, because we're actually saying a population spread into Africa, not just culture. We're saying that the population spread and migrated into Africa from the Near East. That's actually demic diffusion, not cultural diffusion. All right, so let's keep reading. So again, he's bringing up that wheat, barley, goats, and sheep went into northern Africa from Southwest Asia, the Near East. And its relation to the Afrasian language group is a good example. A minority argue that Afro-Asiatic is Asian in origin, which requires opposing standard linguistic evidence. The majority that it is African. Either position or origins influence any subsequent interpretations. Unfortunately, both models are not usually presented in published work, so an imbalanced picture is presented. Most genetic studies and or interpretations have proceeded from models in which either ancestral Afrasian or a later branch, for example, Berber, are posited to have come from the Near East with the spread of food production without the consideration of alternatives, which is problematic when not simply wrong. For a correct, generally, population migration versus cultural diffusion is given the primary responsibility as the mechanism of change. Here is explored the ramifications of taking into account the views of mainstream linguists, as well as archaeologists, in the examination of the genetic data. The issue is the construction of the most credible narrative that is balanced and fair. The study of individual Afrasian languages, and then later the family itself, formerly called Hamido-Semitic or Semito-Hamitic, has a long history. The great interest, at least in part, is because this family gave rise to the Semitic languages found in the texts used in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Ancient Egyptian is the other member that receives substantial attention. Afro-Asiatic has another distinction related to the study of African peoples because it connected to a theory of biological and cultural origins called the Hamitic hypothesis, promulgated by C.G. Seligman. This thesis posited that Southwest Asian peoples called Hamites, distant relations of Semites, came into Africa, bringing a new language family, pastoralism, superior culture, and unique and superior biology marked by narrower noses, faces, straightened hair, and lighter skin, although curiously not the skills of plant agriculture. Nearly all instances of culture in Africa deemed to be noteworthy from a Western perspective were attributed ultimately to the contact with Hamites. Thus, many African societies by this myth were rendered non-African in a model of culture that was clearly thought to be genetically determined. The Hamitic hypothesis was overturned by Greenberg and others and abandoned by Africanist historians. Let me stop right here and talk about the Hamitic hypothesis, because many people will say, well, you Israelites subscribe to the Hamitic hypothesis. No, we don't. We don't go around teaching that Hamites brought culture and civilization into Africa primarily or solely by themselves. We're not saying that. We're not even teaching that. When we teach about what he was bringing out about the Bantu expansion, Haplogroup E, we're saying those people are Shemites. We're not saying they're Hamites. We're saying they're Shemitic. They come from Shem. That's what we're saying. We're saying our ancestors come from Shem. We're not claiming Ham. So a lot of times people throw that title on us. Oh, you guys are following the Hamitic hypothesis, and it could not be further from the truth. All right, let's go. Let's get back to it. It says the Hamitic hypothesis were overturned by Greenberg and others and abandoned by Africanist historians. The majority of historical linguists who study the family read the evidence as supporting that Afrasian is a family of African origin in history, with one branch Semitic having had an ancestor that was carried to Asia, the Near East. They generally agree, based on evidence, that the proto-language was spoken by hunters and gatherers, not farmers or pastoralists, i.e. food producers. In a recent study by Gabri Meskel and Ibrahim, the YE haplogroup was found to map with this family, which is not to say that genes determine languages or language family classification. The principle of greatest diversity indicates Africa to be the geographic cradle, and the concept of the least moves that the Horn of Africa or the southeastern Sahara is more specific locale of the ancestor. It is generally true that the place of greatest diversity of an evolving population or language, all other things being equal, is likely the place of origin. Care has to be taken to understand that, in theory, if a broad sample of population migrated, that the level of diversity or something close might travel with it, although this is seldom the case. Of equal interest is that the branch of Afrasian Omotic, believed to be the least derived in its relationship to the ancestral proto-family, is found only in the Horn of Africa, specifically Ethiopia. If this branch is not considered to be in the family, it becomes the nearest relative to the group and still anchors the proto-family in Africa. Studies involving genetics, Afrasian, and food production should always examine hypotheses based on different models of geographical origins and the internal structuring of a language phylum. This does not mean that genetics can be used to determine internal structuring or membership in the phylum. What happens when genetics and linguistic data are considered in the terms of the African origin models? The recent spread of Arabic has to be ignored in the presence of Semitic languages in Ethiopia based on the standard linguistic interpretations. The Y chromosome data are used. They are the most complete for the greatest number of members of the family. The core distribution of the family runs from Eastern Africa, north to Egypt, and west along the Mediterranean littoral. The subfamilies once spoken here are Cushitic, Kenya, Tanzania, Somali, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Ancient Egyptian and Egyptian Nile Valley and Berber spoke in Siwa oasis of Egypt and western Morocco and south into Mali and Mauritania. Collating the data from various studies indicate that TOC49A F haplotype V is the predominant variant in this region overall. It has notably lower frequencies in the Near East. This is exactly what we expected for an African model of origin, assuming that the language family was initially and primarily spread by the migration of humans and not by cultural diffusion. Furthermore, genetic studies that were not concerned with language confirm this. For example, Underhill stated that the V38M35 lineage was carried into the Near East from Africa in the Mesolithic. And that's huge because, again, V38 is E1B1A. So Dr. Ibrahim Muntaser is telling you that there are studies that can show and demonstrate that E1B1A was carried into the Near East. This V38M35 in Africa corresponds to the 49AV. It is far more likely the pre-Proto-Semitic speakers that went into Near East at this time, where Semitic languages have long since dominated. But the predominant haplotypes in most Semitic-speaking peoples are variants 7, 8 in the TAQL49AF system, which are equivalent to M89 associated lineages. The most parsimonious explanation is that the ancestral Semitic was adopted by those bearing haplotypes 7 and 8. It is not argued here that there was not been some two-way migration between Africa and Asia, but in this instance, the predominant migration was from Africa. Let's keep going. The underived V38M35 lineage is found primarily in East Africa, and most of the variations and derived and related clades are in Africa. Wheat and barley agriculture in Africa is first attested in northern Egypt around 5200 BC, dating to some 2,000 years after its emergence in Asia, the Near East. Based on the standard archaeological evidence, however, it appears as another item in indigenous foraging strategy, not as total change in substance and pattern. Newer work not cited here confirms this perspective. This finding is not consistent with a mass migration hypothesis of settlers, colonists involving farmers from Asia. By this time, Afrasians have already begun to differentiate, or was already differentiated at some level. Among the earliest agriculturalists in Asia, the Near East were speakers of common Semitic based on vocabulary reconstructions. There have been mass migrations into Africa of rapidly multiplying farmers, though who came to be known as the ancient Egyptians, quote unquote, would have been Semitic speakers. Curiously, not even the term for sheep, goat, wheat, or barley in ancient Egyptian are Semitic loanwords. This has interesting implications in light of recent evidence for seed collecting and management in the Green Sahara around 10,000 years ago. This example reveals the complexity of attempting to synthesize various kinds of data. There can be no expectations. Priority means just to know beforehand that we already know, like common sense. Afrasian and the speakers offer other fascinating findings that invite a critical historical inquiry. Chadic speakers living primarily in the central Sahara and northern Nigeria have a very high frequency of an M89 lineage of an R1 subclade. Remember, we brought up that R1. That is a European subclade. They descend from European males. That's what that means, right? And they live where? Central Sahara and northern Nigeria and Western Africa. Let's keep reading. These Chadic speakers phenotypically are generally very dark skinned with frizzy hair and the facial conformation often thought of as representative of the African, a point that will be revisited later in relation to the classification of Chadic when Afrasian. Curiously, the frequency of this lineage is far greater in some Saharo-tropical population samples, over 90%, than it is in the Near East. Its putative place of origin. So again, they're saying R, haplogroup R, came from the Near East. So what does that tell you? Real quick, I'm going to pause from reading and talk about it. So what does that tell you? That tells you that there was a migration of people that came from the area, Asia, the Middle East, Eurasia, whatever you want to call it, into Western, and eventually made their way into Western Africa. How do we know that? We see the descendants there. We see the Chadic people there. We see them there. Let me read some comments. Original one says, The majority of black men in America descend from white males. That is not true. That shows the racism in DNA. They haven't tested every black male. No one said that majority of black men in America descend from white males. A percentage of them do, though. No one said majority of them do. I don't know where you got that from, brother. Yosef Ben Israel says EP252L3 E1B1A. No, EP2 is the father or progenitor of E1B1A and E1B1B. All right, let me get back into the reading, man. What's going on, Jeremiah?
Yo.
What's going on? Let me get back into this, man. All right, it says a point that will be revisited later in relations to the classification of the Chadic with the Afrasian. Curiously, the frequency of the lineage is far greater in some Saharan tropical population samples, over 90%, than it is in the Near East, its putative place of origin. So seeing that these people are in Western Africa, we see their descendants in Western Africa, that shows human migration, demic diffusion, a population moving from one area to another. How do we know that? Because we can see the DNA in other parts of the world, like Asia, like Europe, and we can see their descendants in Western Africa, in Nigeria, in the Saharan. That's that irrefutable proof, man. So if anybody's going around saying there was no migration between these two areas, they're wrong. Are they going around saying nobody went to West Africa for thousands of years and we were locked there? They're wrong. They're wrong. They're just simply wrong. Let me keep reading. It says this is likely due to genetic drift. The frequencies of R1 are not nearly as high in Nile Valley, Egypt, and other parts of the super-Saharan Africa. What are the historical explanations for this lineage and its distribution, or what could they be? Some writers have postulated that the presence of the lineage corresponds to the bearers of the Chadic family of Afrasian spreading into Central Sahara based on the presence of the RVA8 marker. For some, this would be a reminiscent of the Hamitic hypothesis, but should not be confused with that project because of the relatively low frequency of this clade in other branches of the Afrasian. Interpretation of Y chromosome data, including short tandem repeats, variability from Equatorial Guinea, suggests that the VA8 marker may have arisen on the R1 background south of the Chad Basin and spread north instead of the reverse. It may very well be the language family spread independently of the lineage, with the lineage being in the region before the Chadic language family. The presence of the R haplogroup should probably be simply conceptualized as a Paleolithic back migration without any necessary cultural implications. In this scenario, it becomes a part of a biological ancestry of regional people subject to local evolutionary forces. In layman's terms, there was a migration of these people going into Africa and ending up in Nigeria in the Chadic region of Africa, man. We can clearly see it because the descendants there carry the DNA that's foreign to that part of the world. It says its distribution in circum-Saharan areas may reflect later movements of Saharan peoples during the mid-Holocene droughts. Another explanation is that some areas of Central Sahara and Nigeria were settled in part by Assyrian refugees in the last millennium BC. Maybe y'all didn't hear that. I'm reading a geneticist book right here. This is a doctor. This is a PhD I'm reading. Dr. Ibrahim Muntaser from Sudan. And this is in his book. Some areas of Central Sahara Nigeria were settled in part by Assyrian refugees in the last millennium BC. What is the evidence they're using to come up with this interpretation? It says you got foreign DNA in the Chadic speakers. You also have foreign DNA in the Fula people, the Fulani people. How did it get there? Demic diffusion, a population moving through space and time, a population migrating in times past. And he's quoting Derek Lang. Now watch this. This interpretation of the archaeological and cultural evidence has not gained wide acceptance among historians. So why? Because they want to make these people Africoid and Africoid only. All right, so let's keep reading. It is of some historical interest and still very revealing that although some linguists in the early 20th century thought that Chadic was Afrasian, others greatly resisted its classification into the family. This was not based on linguistic data, but rather on the fact that the Chadic speakers were black or blacker than other members of the family. This illustrates the problem. Leaving alone the bias for a moment, I have an expectation that all connections or relationships will be between entities perceived as being uniform in all respects. In other words, if it ain't white, it ain't right. This is how these people is looking at this, man. Oh, well, they black. How can we put them and group them in the same category as these other white Europeans? But they got the same damn DNA as these people. Meaning they share the same male ancestors. All right. And this is why earlier I said many of y'all that's in the Israelite community, in the conscious community, you have to erode those old bad teachings that came from scientific racism. We still using it in 2021. It's still being stated on side of the TV. It's still being stated by the conscious community, and it's still being used and stated by the Israelite community. This black and white false dichotomy. Well, this person can't be this because he ain't black, or vice versa. That's not how genes and genetics work. That's not how you determine a genealogy at all. And just like Dr. Muntaser said, this illustrates a problem. Leaving alone the bias for a moment or having expectation that all connections or relationships would be between entities perceived as being uniform in all respects. Uniform meaning being the same in all respects. Meaning if they got the same language, they got to have the same language, they have to look the same, all the same traits. And that's not true. Especially if you have moved from your place of origin and you have separated from the base population that you're from for thousands and thousands of years, you're going to adopt and assimilate with the community that you are with. That's in the Bible. When the Northern Kingdom got exiled, many of them became the Gentiles. Many of them became the Assyrians, became like the Assyrians. That's explained in the book of Tobit. That's even prophesied in the book of Genesis chapter 49, where it says Ephraim shall become a multitude of nations. That's what happens when you separated from your core populations and you're not involved in a society that has those traditions. You're going to absorb another one. Case in point, the slave trade. Many of y'all speak English because you're in a society that predominantly speaks English. Many of y'all have American traits because you're in a society that predominantly does those things, that watch football, basketball, so on and so forth, eat hot dogs and all that. So, of course, you're not going to be like your ancestors. So anybody coming with these old, tired arguments, oh, you don't look like this, you don't do this, why you don't keep... That is unscientific. Has nothing to do with genes. Our argument is that we descend from these people. That's our argument. And that's the same argument we find in the Bible. It's about bloodline. That's why they kept the pedigrees intact in the book of Chronicles. It's about tracing the bloodline. Let me keep reading. It says, this issue is made even more ironic when it's understood that some groups of sample Chadic speakers have a higher percentage of Eurasian Y lineage than do others who were categorically seen as closer kin to Europeans. The Afrasian-speaking regions of Africa are anciently connected to speakers of other families via their common P2 father. P2 is our ancestor, right? This deep genealogical geographical relationship proceeds that of more connections gained through migration causing gene flow. So what does he point out? That was a migration of our ancestors. The E haplogroup places their male affiliation in Africa, no matter the time depth for any given branch. A critical narrative to explain the mtDNA profiles have not yet been deployed and may not match expectations based on Y chromosome findings. All right, we're gonna go to the next section: genes, ethnopopulation origins, and identity. The subject of origins is complex because of the term's various meanings. The origin of a population has multiple dimensions. These include language, biology, and culture. As noted, these are not causally related or linked, but sometimes may travel together. Again, what we brought out earlier, language, biology, and culture, they're not intrinsically linked. So again, someone comes to you, you say you're an Israelite, what they gonna say? Why don't you speak Israel? Why you don't speak Hebrew? Why don't you speak Hebrew? Why would I speak Hebrew? Like I'm supposed to be born with all of the grammatics of Hebrew because I claim to be an Israelite. That makes no damn sense. Again, you learn the language in the society that you're in. The reason why the Ashkenazis teach or speak that Hebrew that they claim to speak is because they're in a society that teaches it to their children, not because they were born with it in their genes, in their DNA.
This is why it's important, man. This is why culture is important. Once you become amalgamated into a different society, you're going to take on their culture. You're going to take on their practices. You're going to take on their ways. This was also prophesied in the scriptures that the children of Israel would do this. It did not say that they were going to be holding on to their identity. A part of the curses is to lose your identity, right? So you got people out there that's making an argument. These Jewish people claiming to be Jews are more Jews than we are because they keep the culture. Well, we have to take consideration what transpired with the children of Israel, how they got in this state in the first place. Once you are disconnected from your land, you've already begun the process of a cultural assimilation. So now, as you get further and further from the people that separated from the land initially, you lose something with each generation. Right? Especially when you are being pressured to conform. This is why the Native Americans have lost a lot of their way, because they're being pressured to conform. You're pressured to dress a certain way. You're pressured to speak a certain way. You're pressured to act a certain way. This is cultural amalgamation. And then you come along and say, well, and then my thing is, Joshua, why they don't ever ask the Native Americans those same things they say about us? You know, why you say, well, why you ain't dressing with feathers on your damn head and all that? Why you got a baseball cap on with Jordans, right? you don't ask the damn Chinese man why he wearing Jordans, man. But when it comes to us, it's always something. Now, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to add that little bit, man. You rocking and rolling, man.
No, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's on point. That's on point, man. Because what you're showing is, and we arguing that we got the biology of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That don't mean we're gonna all have the language and the culture of them people. Because, like you said, slavery, indoctrination, assimilation, we far removed from that. You understand? But those that argue against us think that we should be born with all those things in us. That's not how it works, man. All right, let me keep reading. It says, as noted, these are not causally related or linked, but sometimes may travel together, at least over the short term. Assumptions cannot automatically be made about this. Another issue is related to the question of origins in the terms of time.
Hey, Joshua, I don't mean to cut you, man. I want to ask you something real quick, man, because it's right on the topic, right? There was a conversation I was having with a person that will remain nameless, okay? that asked me this. He says, listen, why are you brothers trying to be Jews? What's wrong with being, now listen to this logic, bro. What's wrong with being West African? What's wrong? West Africa has beautiful culture. They have beautiful weddings. They have beautiful minds, intelligent people, doctors, inventors. it's much to be proud of, right? You know what I asked him? Well, if the culture is so beautiful, do you practice the culture? Did you have a West African wedding? Do you dress West African? Do you have West African cultures and celebrations within your household? Are you teaching these things to your children? Then he switched it up and said, "Nah, because we have beautiful stuff here in America. We have American culture. You Negroes don't got no culture, man. What you have is you have taken the culture of your oppressor and you have put flair to it. You have put different type of style to. You get married like the white man. You get you damn you celebrate. Your celebrations are the same celebrations as the white man. Okay. When you go out, you damn, like you said earlier, the ball games and ball caps and all this is their culture. But when we do it, we bring a different type of flair to it, and they want us to be okay with that. But got the nerve to question me about the culture that I identify with and tell me I should be satisfied with being a West African and I should be practicing West African culture, but he himself, who's speaking to me, doesn't practice West African culture. Is that hypocrisy or am I tripping?
Man, that's hypocrisy to the T, brother. That's hypocrisy. And when you hit it on the head when you interrogated him to see if he was doing those things that he was trying to get you to do,
right.
And he ain't doing none of them because he don't know what he's talking about anyway. It's so many different African customs. Which one? Which tradition?
Right.
Come on, man. Yeah, bro. So we got a lot of work to do. All right, man. Let me get back into this. So basically, Dr. Muntaser was going over that language, biology, and culture. They not linked together, man. You learn language and culture while you're alive. Biology is given to you during sex, during reproduction. They not fused together, man. You don't get that from your father and your mother, in the womb. It's not how it works. But a lot of these people pose these questions as if it does work that way, but it doesn't. All right, let's keep reading. It says another issue is related to the question of origins in the terms of time. How far back into the past can a specific ethnic group as known in the ethnographic present be traced? And I'm going to answer this real quick. If you go back 400, 500 years, it ain't going to be no such thing as no African American, man. You go back 300, 400 years, ain't gonna be no African American. So they're a race. So what were we before then? And those are the questions we're trying to answer with DNA, this human migration and migration patterns that we're studying, right? All right, so to keep reading, it says, it is important to remember that the external biological traits of a culturally defined group can change based on intermarriage if social rules permit and cultural values are not exclusionary based on external phenotype. Gene flow connotes changes in ancestry. Unseen genetic variation can obviously also change. A great example to this is I think the Herodians in the Bible. They came in, they adopted the culture because the Hasmoneans, John Hyrcanus, forced a group of Edomites to convert and take on our way during the time of the Hasmoneans and when the Pharisees came into power. So they became and adopted our culture. They do that for hundreds of years. Now they identify themselves as what? Jews, as Israelites. But they're not Jews genetically. They're only Jews because they passed down the culture. That's why it's important to know language and biology and culture are not linked, man. So just because you see a group of people that may carry the culture in the present time doesn't mean they go back to those people that carried it originally. You know what I'm saying?
Especially when you have a tracked migration and an identifying conversion. When you can go into a history and see when you got people in Poland who's practicing Judaism and they're called Ashkenazi. And then you ask them, well, Ashkenazi is of the seed of Japheth. And they say, well, we're not Ashkenazi. We just live there. We moved there. Okay, where did you come from? And when you start going with the migration, as the brother's bringing out, and you see a point in history of a mass conversion, you have to take that in consideration when trying to identify a people, man.
Facts. That's what's being largely ignored by Garfield. Garfield was on this channel talking about we know they the real Jews because we got documentation of them, practicing certain traditions in the 6th century, man. But again, you basing it solely on culture. These people converted, as you brought up. Many of these people converted. The Khazarians, the Ashina tribes, that's all written in history, like the brother brought up. So again, just because somebody is practicing it now doesn't mean that they come from the original population, right? And that's what Dr. Muntaser is bringing out. It says, likewise, the cultural traits of a group defined biologically at any level can change by the adoption of new languages and customs. Of course, the definition can also change over time and space. All of these increase the work of the population biologists interested in the dimensions of history or reconstruction of genealogy. Research on the origins and the current genetic profiles of groups with particular ethnic designations can illustrate the benefits of better multidisciplinary cooperation. A case in point is that of the Fula, who are perhaps best known in West African history as Islamic reformers in the 19th century. The Fula, variously called Fulani, Fulbi, Pula, and Pool, have sometimes been seen as an anomaly in tropical West Africa due to the physiognomy and skin color of the most distinctive subgroups, which on average have been noted to usually be different than the West African stereotype. Many have narrow noses, faces, and copper-colored skin. Fulani communities can be found in the Sahel belt from Senegal to Sudan, with southern extension into the Cameroons. In a recent report, the origin of the Fulani is said to be unknown, with tradition relating them to the Hyksos and Nubians, and their language is said to be related to Berber, an Afro-Asiatic family member. However, current research places the group's homeland in West Africa and the Fulani language in the Niger-Congo family. The Hyksos invaded Egypt from the Near East in the 1800 BC and likely were Semitic speakers. They were defeated and eventually returned to Asia. There is no evidence that they reached Western Africa or penetrated into the population of the Sahara or Sahel, and there is nothing about the Fulani that would seem to be primary evidence that indicates a specific Hyksos origin. The Nubians who live in southern Egypt and Sudan speak languages of the Nilo-Saharan family, and while there are populations that speak languages in this family far west of the Nile Valley, there is nothing specifically Nubian that would make for convincing evidence that the Fulani have a specific Nubian origin. In short, neither Hyksos nor Nubians can be shown to have likely been the ancestral group at the root of the historical origins of the Fulani. In terms of historiography, these accounts are not justified. The Balanta are another example, a population having some mtDNA signatures that are unexpected in the Senegambia. Specifically, they have haplogroups that are called Eurasian. This group from Senegambia region is said to have a tradition that they were related to Sudanese from whom they would have separated 2,000 years ago with the first spread of Kushites migrations. Another hypothesis offered that derives them from a Bantu branch which separated in the Pleistocene near the Nile. Many West African people have traditions of origins. Hold on, listen to this. Many West African people have traditions of origins from the East. Some of these may reflect the influence of Islamic groups or migrations related to climatic or other events. The word Sudan is Arabic and would suggest a period of interactions later than ancient Kushites, who were not Arabs or Arabic speakers. Sudan is also a generic term, the last part of the phrase, Bilad al-Sudan, land of the blacks. And in African historiography, Western Sudan refers to the Sahel belt of West Africa. Current research suggests that the quote-unquote Kushites of the Nile Valley are believed to have spoken a language from the Nilo-Saharan family, although another opinion is that languages were Afrasian. Furthermore, the Balanta do not speak a Bantu language, and this family is not thought to date to the Pleistocene, but rather to the late mid-Holocene at the earliest. The Niger-Congo family does not have a branch in the Sudan. The Cordofian, but it's not linguistically close to the Balanta. Current research does not speak of the Kemetic invasions and is not certain to which invasions. Kemetic is a synonym for Hamitic, a term no longer in common usage in modern African studies because the theories associated with it have been proven wrong. There's a little reason to think that the Balanta as a people have come from the Sudan, but migration of an element of their population from the east is very likely. So he's saying that these people have genetic information, genetic DNA, the females, the mtDNA is mitochondrial DNA, that can link them from coming from the east. So again, so all these people saying that people were stuck in the West Africa for years and years and years are wrong. Because we clearly can see that there was long distance migration from the east into the west. We clearly can see it. We can see it with the Chadic people, and now we're looking at the Balanta people and the Fula people. Let's keep reading. This does not deny migration since examples of long distance migration in Africa exist, that they were related to the Sudanese from whom they could have separated 2,000 years ago with the first spread of Kushite migrations. Hold on, then I think I'm on the same page. This is not denied migration since, oh yeah, I didn't turn the page, my bad. Such as Arabs coming into Africa, Fulani migrating across the Sahel, the West Africans making the Hajj and not returning. The traditions of long distance migration to explain origins may have some reality. So we got to understand that, like all these traditions, the oral traditions, these narratives about having long distance migrations, they're being considered by the scholars. It says may have some reality. Let's keep reading. It says, but not in literal terms that they are expressed, and has been established that they generally cannot be accepted literally as historical documents, especially if they use terms that are chronologically dissonant. And the events they are very remote in time. Specialists in the historiographic use of oral traditions, a debated field for some time depths, have developed methods to interrogate them. The ideas reported about Balanta and Fulani are based on older literature and set up investigators to give unfair accounts. A non-West African origin for these people as a whole people is not supportable based on the current research of specialist historians, but genetics do in the case of the Fulani. Why? Because the Fulani have foreign DNA. Right? It said the distribution of these people written in oral texts from the regions, linguistics, and archaeology invite priori a holistic approach based on more recent research. It is very important to say that the authors do not say that they necessarily accept the reported views, but unfortunately, they do not present other alternatives, which makes it difficult for the readers. It is not possible to know which ideas of historical interest only as opposed to being presented as current viable hypotheses. The mtDNA profiles of the Balanta and others may reflect ancient interactions or medieval ones. It is worthwhile recalling that according to the Al-Amari in the Masalik al-Abasar, that Mansa Musa, king of Mali, brought back to Mali in the 14th century various females purchased in the markets of Cairo, some of whom were Asian, quote-unquote, Turk origin. There were many kinds of interactions in the Sahel region. Although the Balanta were not part of the imperial Malian system, their eastern origin stories may place some of their ancestors in the Sahara, a place of interactions of many peoples. Another example of origin issues conflate material culture similarities with identities. In non-standard linguistic analysis, genetic similarities in the circum-Mediterranean region have been postulated to be related to population movements that also have linguistic correlates of questionable validity. It is argued that many languages of the Mediterranean region are related to the family group called Eusko-Mediterranean, or the UM, which includes Etruscan, Berber, Egyptian, and the Basque. Early Nile Valley populations from the Barbarian culture were suggested to have migrated to Spain based on pottery similarities, which on critical examination are not supported. Other movements of ancient Saharans to Europe were postulated, and while these cannot be dismissed, better evidence will be welcome to support this idea. The UM grouping is not part of a current language classification, which does not mean it should be discounted out of hand, but is orthodoxy should be acknowledged and its validity demonstrated by the totality of current linguistic methodology. It is not inconceivable that there were many movements back and forth between Mediterranean Europe and Africa, but the theory of deep cultural unity implied by the hypothesis is not well supported. In the case of the Barbarians, they were a part of a cultural tradition in Sahara Nile region. So, real quick, in summary, what we just read, again, this is a scholar, this is a doctor, this is a PhD, he has his PhD in genetics. And he does not doubt that these migrations happen between these localities, between Europe, between Africa, between Near East, between the East, whatever, to West Africa. We can see that these scholars are getting together, writing papers, and they are acknowledging that these things could be true, that these things could be grounded in reality. This is far different from what you hear from the conscious community, Sonetta TV, and these clowns on YouTube, man. They giving you a cup of dirty water, man. So you come to the source, we're going to give you filtered, clean water, mineral water. All right, let's keep reading. This case illustrates how collaboration would have strengthened or altered the hypothesis. Standard archaeological and linguistic interpretations would have been contributed by specialists. Now we're going to read genetics in the northern Nile Valley, Egypt. Got 10 more pages to go, so y'all just hang in there, bear with me. All right. It says an example of the utility of historical resources to explain spatial genetic variation can be found in the studies of Egypt, a country not only at the crossroads of three continents, but with a well-studied history based on texts, archaeology, and climatology. Egypt flanks the Nile Valley and can be conceptualized as a linear oasis in the Eastern Sahara Desert. It had numerous settlements dotted along its length since the mid-Holocene. Patterns of Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA genetic variation in the Egyptian Nile Valley corridor both show opposing inclines for different haplotypes. For the Y chromosome study, for the mtDNA analysis, one Y chromosome study uses TAQL49AF probe found geographical substructuring in Egypt of the most prevalent variants, which are haplotypes V, IV, and XI. Haplotype V, called northern, decreases in frequency from northern Egypt to southern Egypt, southern Nubia. IV and XI, called southern, increase in the opposite direction. Upper Egypt had intermediate frequencies that were not overall statistically different from those in Nubia, located immediately south of Upper Egypt. In another study, mitochondrial DNA haplotypes designated northern and southern were also found to be distributed differently. The geographical labeling of variants clearly implies a model explanation that posits two fairly distinct populations that have created a zone of integration in the Nile Valley by bidirectional gene flow. The observed distribution of these haplotypes has been suggested to perhaps be related to three ancient military campaigns: the invasion or occupation of Nubia by Egypt on two occasions, the Middle Kingdom, 1600 BCE, and New Kingdom, 5050 to 1300 BC. The last for 500 years in terms of Egypt by Nubia, 750 BC, for less than 100 years. Later migrations from Europe in the Near East during Greco-Roman, Islamic, and Ottoman periods may have made significant contributions. The spatial distribution has been suggested to be related to movements caused by military conflicts in two studies, and I want to make commentary on that. Stop saying that Egypt is this uniform people, because we clearly just read that if these three military campaigns are true, in the history of Egypt, of people coming in, like the Hyksos coming in, foreigners coming in, the Syrians coming in, how can they all be the same people? Every time you read Egypt, you're thinking everybody's uniform, everybody's the same race, everybody's of the same ethnic group. That's not true, because you had different groups move in and move out. You had wars, people getting taken as captives, back and forth throughout time. So different time periods, you had different people ruling and living in Egypt. It's just that simple. It's that simple.
Yeah, man. Even for you Bible thumpers out there, you can read it in Exodus chapter 1. It says a new king arose in Egypt, meaning new, different from the former dynasty. a new dynasty. That's why when you hear in the conscious community, you hear them talk about this dynasty and that dynasty. That means that they were different ruling people from the other. Different bloodlines, different people were ruling in Egypt.
Right. That's a fact, man. That's a fact. So when people try to connect themselves to Egypt, Egypt is a hodgepodge of people, man. Which people you talking about? What period of time you talking about?
Right. That's like saying American is a race.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. When this is a damn melting pot, man. All right. Let me read this. It says no alternative explanations were offered. While the military explanations are somewhat attractive to explain the pattern of the most common variants, they are likely to be inadequate. At these dates in the Nile Valley, population sizes were large, and unless there were specific policy of population replacement or marrying local women, soldiers are not likely to have so large a genetic impact as indicated by the Y chromosome data. The findings do encourage the exploration of non-genetic data to understand social practices which can affect gene frequencies. It is known in the late period that Alexander encouraged his troops to marry local Egyptian women. There is no historical evidence suggesting that foreign troops gave their daughters or sisters in marriage in any period to those being occupied in a consistent fashion, thus making it less likely that the military incursions explain the mtDNA patterns.
Hold up, man. That's a major source right there. We don't want to skim over that. Read that again about Alexander, what he told his army.
Oh, yeah. It is known in the late period that Alexander encouraged his troops to marry local Egyptian women. There is no historical evidence suggesting that foreign troops gave their daughters or sisters in marriage in any period to those being occupied in any consistent fashion, thus making it less likely that military incursions explain mtDNA. And again, mtDNA comes from the women. It says historiographically, the claim based on mtDNA implies evidence that does not exist, and there has been incomplete enumeration of reasonable possible causes for the pattern. Together, these make an explanation of example of misplaced concreteness. There is evidence for strong trade relationships with the Near East during the pre-dynastic period in Egyptian settlements in the Near East as early as the proto-dynastic periods. So this is going back like 3,000-4,000 years before Christ. There have been established a basis for unions to cement trade relationships. A steady stream of such marriages over 3 millennia would most certainly had an impact. So basically what he's going over is a video I did already on the channel, the history of Egypt and the Levant. This is why you have what they call quote unquote African skeletons all over the Levant and the Levant corridor between Egypt, because thousands and thousands of years of trade has been established between Egypt and the Levant. Thousands of years. Going back to the proto-dynastic and pre-dynastic periods, you're talking about 5,000 years before Christ. Long-standing relationship. So, of course, you're going to see people from both sides trading with each other, people from both sides being buried in each other's lands and living in each other's lands. That's why I said these places were hodgepodges, man. All right. Keep reading. It says a holistic approach that considers varying time depths will augment or supplant this explanation. One issue concerns that the original peopling of the Nile Valley and how this happened. This means examining data that can plume different time depths. The evidence can come from archaeology, various texts, in addition to the biological data. Is the north-south distribution of variance valid for all markers? Is it possible that the model positing the interaction of idolized discrete groups is false, and that the model that postulates more populations more as processes is more accurate? Archaeological data supports the post-glacial repeopling of the eastern Sahara after a long late Pleistocene hiatus, probably from multiple directions. These Saharans were mobile or would have likely interacted. It is hard to envision that there was no gene flow between populations. Evidence indicates Holocene migration to the Nile Valley from the Sahara, thus contributing heavily to the population resident there. Again, when you study this stuff, and basically what he's saying is, through all these periods of time, there has always been migration of people. People were not static and staying in areas for long periods of time. They were moving to and fro, traveling and trading and living. So again, that's a strike, another strike against the unconscious community that's not academic at all and not reading these sources, right?
Hey, didn't you do a show on so-called African Americans relocating to Japan?
No, did I? I don't remember doing that show. What was it about?
Yeah,
What?
You were just bringing out, showing, you know, when you was on your
Oh yeah. I remember that. I remember that.
When you was on that game Ghost, he was on your Tsushi, however you say it.
yeah. Ghost of Tsushima. Yeah. I was watching Asians and blacks in Asia or whatever, blacks in Japan, whatever that channel was.
Yeah, because the reason I'm saying that is an example of people even today relocating and migrating to different parts of the world, man.
Right. Ain't nothing new under the sun, man. Ain't nothing new under the sun. But you got to tell Rob Bourne that, brother. You got to tell him that. All right. It says the migration to the Nile Valley from the Sahara, thus contributing heavily to the population resident there, and a cultural basis for interactions with Sudan during and after the rise of the Egyptian state. Archaeological and textual evidence supports ongoing interactions between Nubian and Egyptian populations before the three military invasions. In summary, there are pre-Middle Kingdom events that should be invoked to explain the distribution of the most prevalent alleles. Pagani have shown that there were substantial migration gene flow into Egypt during the first millennium of the Islamic period, which indicates a change from the original population. Movement from Southwest Asia coupled with social practices of polygamy would have increased non-P2 lineages in the male descendant population and Southwest Asian lineages among females. Migration from other sources would play a role. Social selection may have further amplified these effects. Drift may have contributed it. There would have been gene flow from Southwest Asia and Europe into Egypt during the preceding Christian period, as well due to European and Southwest Asian influence during the Pharaonic period. This the Pharaonic period. That's when the pharaohs, the dynasties, when they say pre-dynastic Egypt, 18th dynasty and all that, you had Southwestern Asian influence and European influence during that time. They don't want to admit that. It says during the Pharaonic period, also based on the Amarna letters, which indicate marriages to Southwest Asian women. What must not be forgotten is that there was an indigenous population in the Nile Valley that emerged from processes in northeastern Africa. All right, so then we go to the next section. But what we got out of that is pretty much what we've been saying all night. Migration. People move, man. People move, especially when it's famines and it's droughts and you can't feed your family or you can't feed the population. You're going to move where you can move, or you can go to and feed and farm and be a pastoralist and be a provider for your family. We see that same motif in the Bible. When it's a famine in Canaan, what they do? They went to Egypt and vice versa. That's what people were doing back then. Let's keep reading. The case of the Nilotics, consideration for population history. This part going to touch on Ham in a minute. I'm going to bring something out about who the Hamites are. And I'm going to do a whole presentation on it. But we're going to touch on it in this section right here. It says the Nilotics and Nilotes, as represented in older literature, are a group of culturally diverse population that reside in southern Sudan, southern Ethiopia, Kenya, and countries of the Great Lakes and Central Africa, who speak what are usually called Nilo-Saharan languages. The term Nilotic can and is sometimes used to refer to any people associated with the Nile, including modern and ancient peoples from Egypt and Nubia, but the term here will refer to the older anthropological usage that may be problematic. Many of the more traditional Nilotes of today practice predominantly a subsistence economy based on cattle pastoralism. This pastoralism may be ultimately related to what Wintergrau have called the primary pastoral community, which was also ancestral to the ancient Nubian and Egyptian cultures. Other names could be chosen for this, given its wide-ranging impacts, such as ancestral African pastoral tradition or Saharo-Nilotic ancestral pastoral tradition. It likely dates to the 6th millennium BC, although its clearest and geographically greatest distribution is demonstrable in the 5th millennium BC. Currently in original homeland and past expansions of Nilotes have largely been based on older work, which has not had the full benefit of synthesis of linguistics, archaeology, and genetics. The construction of a narrative of the history of much of this group, especially the northern groups of the earliest times, is still a work in progress and will require a multidisciplinary approach. Ehret, in the introduction of Southern Nilotic history, a historical work on the Southern or Highland Nilotes, such as the Kalenjin in Kenya, states the nature of this kind of historical work. A people's history does not begin with their memories. It begins rather with their emergence as a separate group. If their emergence and early development lie beyond the reach of the historian's familiar source, human memory as it appears in documents and oral traditions, the historian can therefore say that such events are darkness and not history. It will be a different kind of history. It would not name individual leaders or describe particular wars or encompasses events with precise dates, but it would nevertheless be a history of population movement, cultural change and interchange, and technological development. Let me stop right here and apply this to Eldad the Danite, because people don't want to believe Eldad the Danite when he talks about this movement of Israelites going into Africa. And so, well, that's not real history, but that's history that he brought up from his family, that was passed down from his tribe, and what he was able to see and witness with his own eyes. So again, that account is history. You can say it's not specific, but it's still going to account for what's being said here. History of population,
and that's the primary source, an eyewitness account.
Exactly. It accounts for what? History of population movement, cultural change and interchange, and technological development. That's what we read from Eldad the Danite. So y'all can not accept it all you want, but these things were written down and recorded by this man. All right. So it says the history of Southern Nilotic peoples of East Africa in the eras preceding the 1600s must be this kind of history. So these people in Africa, he's saying that they have this particular type of history, oral testimony primarily, because they don't have anything written down. So they're going based off of that. Who are you to come and discount these people's origin and history and their oral story and testimonies in 2021? All right, so that's something to think about. It says, in general, he makes use of historical linguistics and archaeology in his work. Interest in the Nilotics and Nilotes increased following the publication of the classic Noir by Evans Pritchard, which brought them to a greater notoriety in the Western scholarly community. The accuracy of these accounts as depicting Nilotic history and society is contentious, as might be expected for these older works. Older biases in theory and data collection must be systematically examined in order to make progress. Burton sees Nilotic studies as largely dependent on contingent cross-sectional observations and stresses the need for further historical and scientific data to consolidate or refute the conclusion narratives based on often anecdotal accounts. It is possible that the data from genomics, genetics can provide evidence that can be used in the construction of a more complete narrative history of the Nilotic people, as usually defined. Together with some other Eastern Africans, the classic Nilotes of the Southern Sudan carry in substantial frequency some of these most ancient haplotypes in both male and female lineages. These haplotypes relate them spatially and temporally to early chapters of modern humans' evolution, as suggested by recent work done in Sudan. And this is the part I wanted to bring out. The recovered Y chromosome lineages AM13, BM60, and EM78. Now, these are A and B are separate males having children and descendants. We come from E. They always try to group all the Africans together and say we're the same. We're not the same. A and B are different lineages. That's a different genealogy. We're not from them. These are who we're saying that are the Hamites. According to our model, A, M13, and BM60, these Africans with these haplogroups and these genetic markers would be Hamites. Okay? We have a separate genealogy. We have we descend from different males. Okay? We are a different people than them. All right. So it says are most likely to represent local deep historical descent predating the Nilos to record in the Nilo-Saharan language family, rather than being an outcome of a more recent gene flow. It is noteworthy that haplogroup A, here it is predominantly confined to Eastern Africa and the son of Southern Africa. Their mtDNA similarly displays ancient and ancestral haplotypes, but nevertheless is more heterogeneous than the Y chromosome counterparts. It is likely that the ancestors of those commonly called Nilos used to extend over a wide geographical range based on observed distributions. This distribution of unique, nearly population-specific Y chromosome markers, along with elevated population frequencies, may be assumed to represent a relic of the historical movement and expansion of carriers of these haplotypes combined with evolutionary forces. For example, genetic drift and perhaps some hitchhiking effects. And I want to talk about that. I know it's a lot of scientific jargon, but this is the gist of what's being stated. At one particular point in time, these ancient A and B haplogroups had a wide geographical range, meaning they covered and encompassed most of the known African continent. At one particular time, what happened? They were displaced by our ancestors during what we call the Bantu expansion. We came in, took these people out of their lands. All right, they either laid down or got down. I'm just going to put it to you like that. It was basically the conquest of Africa. Like you read about the conquest of Canaan in the Bible, it was the conquest of Africa going on. We had
that's that's powerful. That's powerful because it's showing, according to DNA, a migration pattern. That's fire, bro.
Mm-hmm. We came in and took the original inhabitants out of that land, displaced the males, and we came and populated Africa. That's what happened in history. That's why he's using terms like relic. Relic means a little bit, relic means like a what's the word I'm looking for? A remnant. That's what relic means. A relic of historical movement and expansion. That's what it means. So they find this DNA, the haplogroup A. It's a relic, a remnant of what it used to be, because it used to cover many areas of Africa, and it's going to go into it. These will be the Hamites according to our model. Watch this. It says, combined with evolutionary forces, for example, genetic drift, perhaps some hitchhiking effects. What does hitchhiking mean? They had to move. They got displaced. So, however, the distribution of these markers should not be used solely as a record of historical expansions apart from social, cultural, and historical context. It is important to reiterate that these ancient markers are older than current ethnic, geographical, and linguistic units. Certain populations harbor more of the most ancient lineages, well, we must be wary of slipping into thinking that these human repositories are living fossils, and that their ethno-cultural or linguistic identities are equal in time depth to those lineages. The predominance, here it is, the predominance of the Y chromosome group A in Southern Africa has been used as a marker of one of the earliest human migrations in Eastern Africa, where early modern human evolution is believed to have taken place. The Sun represents one of the few groups that carry this haplogroup in considerable frequencies, but with a different set of associated mutations than the Nilos, who have also a high frequency of A. So again, these people had a predominance, meaning what? That they dominated these areas, okay, in times past. Before the Bantu expansion, when haplogroup E, our ancestors came and dominated. So if we're going to say and identify who Ham is, you can't just say all black people because, okay, all these groups have black people in it. We have to draw that line of distinction. And if we're going to use the biblical model, we have to say the original possessors of that land would have been Ham. which is these people with haplogroup A and B, these Sun and these Bushman people. And so I keep telling y'all, I keep reiterating throughout the lesson, all Africans are not the same. Who you call an African are not the same genetically. We do not share the same genealogy. We do not share the same ancestors. We do not. Stop spewing that rhetoric. It's 2021, man. Upgrade your scholarship. It says the sun bear little morphological similarity to the Nilotes as used here. This may indicate that the predominance of haplogroup A among the Sun is a product of genetic drift, a relic of an earlier population divergence from the human ancestral population, and that no single physical trait or feature could be ascribed to the ancestral groups of humans, which in any case is not known. Neither Sun nor Nilote morphology likely characterize early moderns. The presence of ancient markers like A in northwestern Africa, along with certain fossils, have led some hypothesizing of origin in that region for modern Homo sapiens. In fact, the phenotype of early modern humans is not known beyond the skeletal anatomy, and this is not completely known because there are not many fossils. The dark skin tone and tall stature of present Nilotes might be an adaptation to the continuous habitation of Sahara in the Sahel area, where rock drawings feature figures resembling potential ancestors of present-day Nilotics. The relative light skin of the Sun may also be extremely ancient or relatively modern on the scales of 10 to 1,000 years. Both rock drawings and complex morphological traits are difficult to date, although it is known that very light skin of some hunter groups is relatively new development, likely dating within the last 10,000 years. These biological traits could also vary over time, with possible reversals or tentative explanations. This is also true for linguistic features like clicks. It is difficult to be certain when they arose. The migration of ancestral Nilotes, and no doubt others from Nile Basin to the Sahara and back, has been attributed to East African and Saharan climate pulses. Diop hypothesized east to west migration based on interpretation of various specific people. First presented his suggestion in the 1950s, his ideas which center on the specific Egypto-Nubian Nile Valley origin. For some West African populations and a relationship with their languages have not been widely accepted, but varying aspects of his work have currency among some scholars. Broadly, he sees legacies of Nile Valley culture in parts of West Africa, an idea that is similar to that of some colonial era Western writers working in diffusionist traditions. A distinction has had to be made between primarily the diffusion of ideas alone versus the mass migration of peoples. Ideas and genes can travel between adjacent populations, in theory making their way over great distances over time. In general, the hypothesis that there was a migration from east to west in the Sahel or Sahara is interesting. The details of any such hypothesis are what have to be elucidated. If there are cultural legacies, how much would this be due to point-to-point migration versus a more complex transmission through geographically intermediate populations? Is the legacy related to what was once called the Aquilitic, a mid-Holocene cultural horizon that shows similar material culture traits from the Nile to the Niger in the first half of the Holocene during the so-called Green Sahara? Or is it related to the recent migratory events in the first millennium BC related to population upheavals in the Eastern Sahel, or earlier dissociation events in the less arid Sahara? There were likely many migration events that can be marked in different ways, given that modern humans most likely originated in Eastern Africa, although some suggest pro-Saharan Western Africa, then east to west migration is given. And it's possible that modern humans arose in Africa due to the interactions of multiple early African populations, not emerging from just one. This would be the people in the Western Africa and likely had different layers and phases. The early Niger-Congo language or proto-language family spread from east to west. The question of when the M2 lineage arose, which is now common and predominant in West Africa, will be relevant to questions of migration, as will be the efforts to ascertain the biological profile of the earliest Sanghe. Of course, populations can be swamped, die out, or be displaced in ways that obscure the complete history of the region. Today's Sanghe, specifically those that live in Timbuktu, are also the descendants and part of the Moroccan soldiers who began to marry local women after the conquest of Sangha in 1591. Songhai-related speakers live along the Niger, just as interesting with the Karange language, of likely Nilo-Saharan affiliation spoken in Algeria. As to direct migration from the Nile Valley at any given time, the data will have to be gathered and examined carefully based on modern standards. It may also be that the Chadic, or rather its speakers, had a bidirectional impact, given Chadic affiliation with ancient Egyptian, or that there were overlapping real effects. Were the several waves of migration after the establishment of modern humans in the region, one washing over the other? What was the mode of migration? Were there local movements of people from one community to another that brought change in language or transmitted other aspects of cultures? Was there an Infocane-like movement at different times by different peoples? Unlikely. There are a few other questions that could be explored. There is likely evidence for migration at different times. For example, possible Christian churches have been found in Chad, perhaps of Nubian origin. The Songhay group of languages spoken along the Niger River are generally considered to be Nilo-Saharan. This would make them geographically an outlier in the Nilo-Saharan family, being the furthermost western group. It is not known with certainty when the speakers first arrived, but this is an interesting question. These Proto-Songhai may have brought a pool of ideas born of a particular Saharan physical and cultural environment, and these may have spread to other groups. The task for archaeologists, linguists, and biologists and cultural anthropologists is to contribute data for the construction of a narrative that meets the previously mentioned standards. Biological and cultural assimilation can take many paths, and sex biases is often a feature. For example, skewed and biased mating practice are often epitomized in ideological or cultural beliefs, such as in marriage culture among Indian castes, and manifests in downward mobility of upper castes, Y chromosomes. This has been seen in other situations with strong dominance hierarchy existed that is supported by social political power. The larger possibilities are also of interest. Groups could change language and culture without much biological assimilation, or even groups could assimilate others via marriage or concubinage and hence change its genealogy without changing culture and language. There are many intermediate scenarios. One can envision an example of such change in situations in which pastoral family units or community loses its herds and joins farmers as a means of survival. Something similar has happened in situations in which farmers have become successful pastoralists that's changing their identity because their farming community does not have a pastoralist community and identity is based on subsistence strategy. Polygamous pastoralist societies are usually male-dominated, and they may adopt wives from local farmer communities rather than allowing access by these communities into their female gene pool. In theory, and depending on larger social environmental context, this might eventuate in language loss or assimilation over time due to language being transmitted via mothers. Let me stop right there. The Bible even talks about that in the book of is it Jeremiah or Nehemiah, the 13th chapter, where they had foreign women and the kids spoke half the language of the Jews and half the language of Ashdod, I believe, or the Moabites or whatever. So that's attested in history as well. And the population geneticists take note of that when sometimes when you have foreign women, the women are usually there teaching and training the children. So therefore they pick up the language of the foreign women. All right, let me keep reading. It says a more likely scenario if the mother's language is widely spoken and the family lives in the mother's community. This obviously would not happen all the time. The foreign women who was brought into a large, stable community would eventually learn this language. It would be less likely if marriages involve moving into regions where the father's language and ethnic group are dominant. This could be modeled using population genetics and network theory in deteriorating environments such as the mid-Holocene Sahara, a situation of a metapopulation based on recent archaeological work. If metapopulation theory with extinctions and correlations is invoked, one can see the emergence of language isolates, great biological heterogeneity, unusual combination of lineages, and other population phenomena which do not conform to expectations. This should be expected to characterize Africa in many regions. Recent analysis of the Y chromosome E haplogroup provides supporting evidence of migrations. The origin and distribution of the E haplogroup and its branches does not indicate migration, but again, the question is the time depth and archaeological correlates of migration. A brief digression is in order. The E haplogroup and the Yap parent have been point of contention, with both being given an African origin by some researchers, the original position of most workers, but now with some postulating an Asian Near Eastern origin. There is no convincing archaeological signal in Middle Stone Age or Late Stone Age for a movement from Asia into Africa. It is just as parsimonious to derive Yap DE from M168 in Africa, with both leaving at the same time, as it is to create a scenario that has multiple migrations coming back into Africa. The DE in Asia will become D and E in Africa. Genetic markers on both Y chromosomes, specifically M78 and mtDNA of the Nilotes, indeed show the presence of haplotypes sharing the pastoralists of other linguistic families. These may be dated to the time subsequent to the domestication of cattle during the early Holocene, namely the root marker M78, a date suggested by Trombetta for the mutation to arise in a time window between 20,000 years ago, which is not yet very different from the 12,000 year ago date suggested by El Hassan for the human expansion associated with animal and plant domestication. However, in the western half of the old world, plant, wheat, and barley domestication is thought to have first occurred in the Levant, specifically among Semitic speakers as found by the late Igor. Some of those ancestral to the early Neolithic population likely had a more direct Eastern African ancestry as determined by analysis of ancient DNA data of some Natufian remains. We have talked about that on the channel. The Natufians have an E1B1 DNA and even having a sub-Saharan African phenotype. All right, reading on. It says there is no evidence that there was a demic diffusion of wheat and barley agriculture plus over caprine domestication in the Nile Valley or Sudan. Demic diffusion means a migration of a cultural trait due to the actual migration of those who practice the specific culture, which have led to the early Egyptians and some Saharans being Semitic speakers. However, this is not the case. Ancient Egyptian is not Semitic, and neither are the original language of Sahara. Berber is not Semitic. The earliest Holocene dates suggested for cattle domestication in Sahara by the late Fred Windorf and his colleagues no longer have wide acceptance, but there is little dispute conceptually in the idea of indigenous cattle domestication in Africa. Pastors likely carried some of these markers to various regions because the local cattle domestication and the emergence of M78 coincide. This possible claim is made with great caution. Interestingly, few of the distinctive markers common among Bantu speakers have been detected in non-Niger Congo speaking pastoralists, with the possible exception of the Lu. If the original homeland of all the cattle herders is the eastern part of the Sahara, then it's possible to make an estimate of the dates of their southward movements to the lakes. Was it a single movement or a successful movement? And to what extent did the environment and political history motivate these waves? Of course, it's important to avoid conflating culture, biology, and language. While these sometimes travel together in whatever combination they are, not obligatorily connected or associated. We discussed that earlier. Analysis of genetic loci with varying evolutionary rates, for example, microsatellite, mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome, and autosomes, might provide reliable estimates of population origins, divergent times, and migration, particularly if these estimates can be dated or linked with confidence to climatic, archaeological, linguistic, and demographic data. This is in keeping with the concern expressed here about how to rank different kinds of data. A possible example is the sickle gene, in which case the admixture between Nilotic, Lu, and Bantu speakers has been inferred based on the presence of the sickle gene among the Lu in Kenya. Current Nilo-Saharan speakers in general are not known to carry the sickle mutation, and by extension have not been populations in which the mutation either developed or became elevated in a high frequency. This observation has been used to date the hypothetical migration of sickle gene across the Sahel to Eastern Africa. Of course, ultimate geographical origins are not known. Such approaches may also be applied that the ancient DNA recovered from archaeological and burial sites. The sickle mutation has been found in the late pre-dynastic Egyptian mummy, which may indicate something about the network of populations in northeastern Africa and the Sahara during the 5th and 6th millennia BC. We stop there for a minute. So if we can see the sickle cell mutation in a pharaoh, then we know that there must have been interactions or migrations between Western and Eastern Africa. It's just, how did it get from Western Africa, which we think is the origin of the sickle cell, into Eastern Africa? Those people had to have been interacting with each other. That's basically what's being said here. So that means people were moving and trading and dealing with each other. All right, so let me keep reading. It says analysis of DNA samples from burial sites in northern Sudan pre-Kerma support a predominance of the Y haplogroup A during the Mesolithic, but sample sizes are not large, and such results must be viewed and used with great caution. So again, during this time in the Mesolithic, there was a predominance in northern Sudan by haplogroup A. This is why I am saying that these people are from Ham. If we want to follow the biblical outline and framework, these people have to be Ham. We don't share the same fathers as haplogroup A and B and the Sun and the Khoisan and Khoi people and the Bush people. All Africans are not the same. These people come from haplogroup A. These people were primarily dominant in these different regions of Africa prior to our arrival. Let's keep going. The history of the Nilotes is an example where genetic data may provide clues and insights on specific historical topics like migration when the historical and archaeological records are insufficient, either because of historical time depth or reasons pertaining to cultural replacement, and hence neither linguistic nor archaeological evidence can give more complete information. However, genetics cannot give all of the answers or relevant data either. The goal is to produce an account that is fair, balanced, and not misleading, and that this is also free of biases, both explicit and implicit. All of the evidence must be carefully interrogated. There is exciting work of young scholars, especially from Africa, those from communities in the Nile Basin from the river's origin to Egypt, where it discharges into the Mediterranean, may be especially interested in this undertaking. All right, so we're going to go into the brief discussion and conclusion. These cases and examples collectively illustrate the value of more aggressive collaboration with the range of specialists from other fields. The examples could be easily multiplied. Multidisciplinary teams can, in theory, help improve the accuracy of research design and interpretation. In work in which patterns of genetic variations are used as primary data to drive interpretations, specialists from other fields can help raise hypotheses about such singularity-based interpretations. In work that derives a framework from non-genetic data, geneticists can help devise models that will count for known facts. The reciprocal illumination afforded by such give and take will increase the value of this work, so the future studies have familiar foundation. African scholars from the Mediterranean coastal countries to the Cape of Good Hope can be envisioned to have a major role in the new research efforts. And that's chapter 1 and 2. And I really wanted to, dig into these chapters because it, for the most part, it tears down a lot of the lies that are being spoke about in the community. All right. And that's right. I'm gonna deal with y'all comments. So we was only going to deal with chapter 1 and chapter 2. A lot of the disinformation that's going around in the community, those first 2 chapters deal with it. I know it's a lot of scientific jargon, a lot of words that you guys might not be familiar with, but many of you guys are equipped with smartphones. You can pause any section of the video and look this stuff up, man, and actually get your research game on. But many of the things that were discussed in today's video and the video that we did yesterday, it tore down the disinformation that all Africans are the same. That's not true. That we all got to be black to be connected. That's not true as well. You have people that look European, which have African haplogroups. We tore down the fable that there was no migrations in Africa. Today we talked about all different type of migrations in Africa. The Chadic speaking people, the Balanta people. We can go on and on and on about different migrations from foreign people coming into Africa, or back migrations, if you will, coming into Africa. So what does this mean? What does this do for our study? This helps our hypothesis. This helps our model the Israelite model, of course, of a migration from the Near East into Africa. We can use these different studies and these different models and this work to articulate those ideas. For instance, if we can show that there was a movement of people from Asia into Egypt, or into Africa, into West Africa, that strengthens our claim because the opposition is saying that never happened. You know, also bringing up that biology and language and culture are not linked. They're not connected together. That's another thing. A lot of people see people practicing a particular culture. It doesn't mean they come or derived from the original people of that culture. That's why I brought up the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty is famous for converting Edomites into the way of the Hebrews, into Judaism. You understand? That doesn't mean that they derive or descend from the original Jews. The Ashkenazis in modern Israel, in the state of Israel, they keep the culture. They keep what they call Judaism, right? That doesn't mean that they come from the original people that are written of in the book. That's why we argue through the genetics, the descendants, who are our forefathers. That's what we're arguing here. But stay tuned. We will be doing a video breaking down who is Ham, what set of people would be considered Ham on the genetic level. And I think we're breaking into untraveled territory. I don't see too many channels or too many people going into the DNA and genetic information, man. And I appreciate everybody that came out. Hit that like button. Share this information on the social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Let's get this information out there. You know, I know the information is lengthy. I know it's long, wordy, a lot of scientific jargon. But, you know, this is really like some college level stuff that we're dealing with. But that's the point. I'm trying to bring and raise the scholarship of the community. Appreciate it, Arye. Appreciate it. Let me read some comments. Arye says the Ibero-Mauritians, Tafarat, and Natufian populations, genetic radius are evidence of the mixed population existing between North Africa and Levant and Mesopotamia. That is correct. That is absolutely correct. And that's really undisputed right now, man. That is a connection. And showing demic migration, demic diffusion of people in a population moving from one area to another, Near East into Northern Africa, the Ibero-Mauritians. So great point. Yeah, a lot of people discount Eldad the Danite, but here's the thing, man. Everything he's saying, like I brought out before, a lot of the stuff he's saying is lining up with what I see with the Bantu expansion. He's showing a foreign group of people coming in and displacing the autochthonous or original inhabitants of Africa, and they did it with advanced tools, advanced weapons. That's the same thing we read about when we read about the Bantu expansion. They were able to take over Africa, take over and displace the San, the Bushman people, the A and B haplogroups, because they had iron technology. They had iron weapons. They had iron metallurgy. Those people still had stone weapons and stone tools. So it was easy for us to take over and dominate those hunter-gatherer groups. And it also was easy for us to do stuff like deforesting, so we can till the land and actually farm. You understand? Farming was actually spread into Africa by our ancestors. So when I read Eldad the Danite, you can call it mythos, but I believe it reflects historical reality, because it lines up with the archaeology and the history of the Bantu expansion and the displacement of the original Africans by haplogroup E, our ancestors, during that time period, which is only about 3,000 years ago, according to the secular timeline. Shout out to Royal Prince. Great information. I try, brother. I try to bring y'all the best, man, the cream of the crop. Arye also said John Revis in Yorkshire was surprised to find he had haplogroup A. Exactly. And that he looks like a white pasty British man, right? These people look like white British males, but they carry an African haplogroup. haplogroup A. That teaches you that you cannot judge people solely on how they look and their phenotypes. And that's what I was trying to drill into the head of the listener tonight and the video we did yesterday. You can look a certain way, but your genes could tell a different story. And that's what I was mentioning, the African Americans. If you go to Family Tree DNA, there's a lot of projects that people do. There's a project, the African American project in Alabama. You can look at each Y chromosome haplogroup, and a lot of those people and those African Americans in Alabama, some of them had R, some of them had G, some of them had European haplogroups, meaning they descend from European males. That's just the truth. They not related to you and I. Yeah, you can email me at HebrewJedi@gmail.com. HebrewJedi@gmail.com. You can email me there, and I interact with you from there. Original one says all those articles says may have, possible, suggest, could. These PhD doctors don't know. Exactly. They don't know. Nothing is for certain. This is called an approximation of the truth. We're trying to get as close to the truth as we can. No one can know for certain because we don't own a time machine. Original one, when you can get a time machine where we can go back and look at the historical events as they come to pass, then we can say we know for 100%. And there's a concreteness to everything we say. No, this is not a priori. This is not something that we know for sure, but we use the evidence to build a narrative. That's the point of me reading this. Yes, these articles are going to say may have or possible. That's called honest scholarship. He's being honest with his writing. He can't. He's a PhD. He can't just go out there and be reckless and say, "I know for a fact these things are wrong," or "I know for a fact these things are true." That's not how academia works and operates, brother. You understand? RE says another excellent presentation, and I try. I know it get long, wordy, and some people might think it's boring, but it's a purpose behind everything I read, man. A lot of information, and I know this information is really on the collegiate level, man. You know, this is really on the collegiate level. All right, I'm looking at the comments from Yahusha Reborn 91. Yahusha Reborn 91. Forgive me if I butchered your name, but he says Klein Winters thinks R1B is historically black. That's true, actually. All the European clades were historically black at one point. Again, the secular timeline, they say white skin doesn't go back into 7,000 years ago. So if white skin was in existence until 7,000 years ago, and 7,000 years ago it was a small, and really they saying one person spread that mutation. That's what they teach in academia. So anytime before that period, all the whole earth, I read the article on live in one of our presentations, the whole earth was brown or melanated during that period. So all of these groups would have been historically quote unquote black. Yeah, let me read some more. Maybe I missed something. I answered that, brother. Original one. Yeah, I think that's it, man. So we're gonna close out. Yeah, man. Yeah. You getting collegiate information for free here on the source, man. For free. You know what I'm saying? RE said good looking. Yeah, the Hebrew Jedi at gmail.com again if you didn't get it. Yeah, man. I try to give y'all top-notch information, man. I don't give you this microwave scholarship like some other groups do, the conscious community Sinetta does, you know what I'm saying? I try to give y'all the best of the best. And you know, it's in video format, so if y'all think it's long, just break it up into portions that are digestible for you and yours. You know what I'm saying? You don't got to take this whole 2-hour, 3-hour video all at once. You can 1 hour, 2 hour, you know what I'm saying? Or break it down, you know what I'm saying? Or whatever you're doing while you're busy, you can be listening to this. Yeah. It is heavy artillery, man, and I'm trying to break it down in a way that people that are from our way of thinking, you know what I'm saying, can use and actually utilize this information to build better models and better arguments for saying that we're Israelites. Just saying, instead of just saying it, you know what I'm saying, have some evidence to back it up. The brother says, "Go longer." No, man, y'all, I can't, because if I do that, then I don't want to have the information overload. I want the information to stick. You know what I'm saying? I want you guys to walk away from this video and have a lot of the information retained. I want the retention. You know what I'm saying? I want y'all to be able to repeat these things, teach these things, and grow from the material. I don't want to, drown y'all out with so much information that y'all lost in the sauce. I want y'all to be able to retain some of these things. Plumente says, always bring a top-notch, great info, bro. Keep up the great work. Keep edifying the community. You know what I'm saying? I appreciate that, brother. I'm going to keep it coming, man. I'm keep it coming. Y'all know how we get down, man. 7 gang, source gang over everything. Man, we say no to vague interpretations. We give thorough breakdowns. Hey, that's for the bros that was with me when I first started my channel. All right, man. If there's any other questions y'all have, if there's not any more questions, I'm going to end the live with a song, and we're gonna be out of here, man. Look forward to the Hamite breakdown. We'll be coming to the channel, giving a presentation about who the Hamites are genetically and our model in accordance to the Bible, and go from there. I think it's going to be groundbreaking, because I don't think anybody else is, taking that approach. I think other people are taking it from an approach that, okay, Ham is black, so all blacks are Ham. And like we illustrated today on the video, no, that's not the case. All black people are not the same. Therefore, all black people can't be Ham. So it begs the question, who are these other black people then? They all can't share the same fathers. We're saying those that come from haplogroup DE, our ancestors come from Shem, and A and B come from Ham. That's what we're saying here at the source. So y'all know how we do, man. You know how we rocking, man. Let's get it. All right, let's close out. Y'all heard me enough. You know what I'm saying? Y'all, hey, hit that subscribe button, like, and share the video. Share the video on the social media platforms. Let's get this information out there. And I'll continue to feed y'all. Let's get it.
On my side, this looks like I'm falling. You can see the twinkle in my eye. Guessing get you stalling. Out you living suicide. Out you living do or die. Getting high, bitch, I'm too fly. Raise the roof to the sky. Proof I never lie. Tell the truth, I never die. To the sky, bitch, I'm too fly. Bulletproof whip, big shout out to I. You gon' listen to the man up in the sky, but you listen to the man up in the skies. Why you know you just choose which way to guide? Rock the boat, shake this bitch from side to side. Make them feel just for their lives, just like you feel just for your lives. I see that look up in your eyes. You might step, but it's only black lies. Wish you niggas realize that ain't gangsta, you won't touch the one that's strength. All in all, the future might just tell them thank you. Right before we blink. $10 by my side. Cause these niggas scared to die. $10 angels by my side. Cause you niggas scared to die. Tears falling down my eyes. Never catching you. Taurus 45 on my side. This look like a balling. You can see the twinkle in my eye. Pussy bitches stalling. Out your leg for suicide. Big shout out to I and
Before we leave, man, just realize Africans are diversified. They're not all the same, and skin color doesn't make you the same either. You understand? You know how we rocking, man. 7 gang, Source gang over everything. We say no to vague interpretations, and we give thorough breakdowns. Gang!